Lord of Mysteries, Incarnation of Chaos by author Yu Shang Wu Wang Chuan. Chapter 426-450. Chapter 426, No One Sleeps Tonight. Since Palace needed some time to resolve the lifespan issue of Mobit Zoroaster and others, Roland naturally wasn't in a hurry to take people into the book for an adventure, choosing instead to rest for a night. During this time, Leonard also connected with Gehrman, handed him Dunn's letter, described the happy married life of the captain and Miss Daly, and shared what he had seen and heard recently. Then you've had quite an exciting time recently. Little Kay listened quietly to Leonard's rambling, then couldn't help but reveal a smile. At this moment, he didn't resemble Gehrman, but rather Klein during his time with the Tingen Nighthawks team. Exciting, yes, but... Leonard clearly recalled something, his expression collapsing as he lowered his voice and said, "Little Kay, you don't know, for some reason, the old man has been crazy recently, constantly forcing me to learn all sorts of knowledge. Am I cut out for that? He just keeps forcing me to learn. Goddess, I'd honestly rather go out and fight 10 more monsters than do practice tests every day." It was clear that Leonard had truly suffered in the knowledge hell for a long time. Little Kay remained silent for a second upon hearing this, and a hint of sympathy welled up in his heart. Although he himself never rejected learning, and even constantly learned various occult knowledge from different teachers, he also knew that Leonard was indeed not cut out for it. But what could Little Kay do? He wasn't familiar with Palace, and frankly, Little Kay actually felt that there was no harm in Leonard learning a bit more knowledge. After all, in this world, knowledge is power, and ignorance brings danger. So, after some thought, Little Kay could only tactfully say, "Learning a bit more knowledge is not a bad thing after all, and Palace means well." Leonard immediately looked at him in shock, his eyes practically screaming, "You betrayed our friendship." This made Little Kay swallow the words that were already on the tip of his tongue. However, a balance between work and rest is also very important. "I will try to persuade Palace not to force you to study too much." Little Kay then gave a Gehrman-esque sneer and said, "It just so happens that Bethel has also been teaching the younger generation of Abraham recently. Perhaps he would be very happy to share his experience in teaching students with Palace." "No, you can't do that." Leonard looked at Little Kay with an incredulous gaze. "No, I can." Little Kay glanced at Leonard, fully displaying Gehrman's coldness. I. Leonard was clearly confused for a moment, his words even a bit jumbled. Seeing him like this, Little Kay couldn't help but sigh and no longer deliberately scare him, saying, "Just kidding, I'll persuade Palace to lighten your study load." Leonard's eyes immediately lit up, and he said, "I knew I didn't misjudge you, Little Kay, you really are my best friend." Cough. Just then, Palace's voice sounded, with a hint of teasing, "Perhaps you still remember, I've been here all along." Although his avatar had gone out hunting, his main body was still with Leonard. Whether Leonard could escape the hell of studying was an unknown. In any case, Anderson didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time he opened or closed his eyes, he seemed to see thousands of pounds of test papers falling from the sky, burying him in an ocean of exams. If it were in the past, he could choose to escape, just like he left the Knowledge Church to become a bounty hunter at sea. But these thousands of pounds of test papers were followed by a candy he couldn't refuse, which made Anderson unable to escape. No matter how much he didn't want to, he could only bite the bullet and actively step into the hell of studying. Perhaps I really should break the habit of provoking others. Anderson looked up at the crimson moon in the sky, and for once, such a thought crossed his mind. But, Anderson then sighed again, muttering softly, "But how boring is life without provoking others?" Just then, Anderson heard a slight movement. He turned to look in the direction of the sound and found that it was Danitz, who had accidentally bumped into something. "Isn't that Danitz? Why aren't you asleep so late?" Anderson raised an eyebrow, looking at the clearly insomniac Danitz, and said with a chuckle, "Could it be that you're too nervous about going on an adventure in the book world tomorrow to sleep?" Danitz, whose secret was revealed, stiffened. He then thought of something, looked at Anderson, and said, "Then why aren't you asleep either?" "I'm admiring the moon, is that not allowed?" "Look how beautiful the moon is," Anderson said with a smile, looking nothing like someone troubled by sleeplessness. "But the captain said you shouldn't just stare at the moon." Danitz gave Anderson a strange look, then seemed to realize something, and suddenly understood. No wonder you have to do thousands of pounds of test papers, turns out you're a bad student too. This time, it was Anderson smiled that froze. How many people didn't sleep that night was an unknown, but Roland slept soundly. When he woke up the next morning, tidied himself, and arrived at the future's dining area, he found several people with dark circles under their eyes. What were you doing last night? Roland asked, taking a sip of coffee. Admiring the moon. This was Anderson, still stubborn. I was a bit nervous and couldn't sleep. This was Danitz, who was cowardly and therefore honest. The old man caught me and made me study all night. I was even dreaming about classes. This was Leonard, with lifeless eyes. I accompanied Leonard for a night of classes. Pallas has great insights into the history of the Solomon Empire and gave me a lot of inspiration. This was Little K, holding coffee with a calm expression. I fished all night yesterday. This was Xiao Amon, who was very happy fishing. I caught several murlocs, why don't we eat them for lunch today? Murlocs are a type of monster, equivalent to incomplete sailors, with some parts of their flesh being very delicious. Murlocs, you say? I've long heard that the 5 Seas have this specialty, we can certainly try it. Roland first affirmed Xiao Amon's suggestion, then looked at Little K and said, really? Then I must consult him. I'm very interested in the history of the Solomon Empire, for example. Pallas mentioned this to me yesterday. Little K replied. The two of them began to discuss back and forth, making the other 3 poor students present feel a pang of sympathy. Leonard. Danitz. Anderson. No, are you guys okay? What's so addicting about studying? Just then, Iceberg General Edwina and Katlia also arrived at the restaurant. Hearing Little K and Roland discussing the history of the Solomon Empire, they became very interested and joined the discussion. This was normal, after all, whether it was Edwina from the Knowledge Church or Katlia as a seeker, both were genuine top students with a strong thirst for knowledge. For a moment, the concentration of learning in the entire restaurant was frighteningly high, making the poor students feel they couldn't stay there anymore. Chapter 427 The World in the Book. Fortunately, this situation didn't last long, because after breakfast, everyone was about to enter the world within the book for an adventure. The members entering the book this time were quite a few. First, Little K and his 2 companions, along with their red maid, then, Leonard, who was essentially Pales's accessory, and finally, Anderson and Iceberg General Edwina. Katlia was responsible for watching over things outside. Wait, why do I have to go in too? Anderson expressed that something about this development seemed wrong. Because we need someone to draw aggro and taunt, and you're perfect for it, Roland said, glancing at Anderson as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But don't you already have an angel entering it? Anderson said, secretly glancing at Pales nearby. What are you thinking? This is an adventure for young people. How can elders participate? Pales is only responsible for solving the lifespan problem. He's not participating in fighting monsters, Roland said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Pales had no objection to this, only looking at Leonard and saying with a chuckle, good luck. This is also a good experience for you. Leonard didn't show any resistance this time. Although he disliked studying, he was quite happy to fight monsters. Alright, then you should at least tell me what our enemy is, right? The book only mentions an ice frost dragon, but what level of ice frost dragon? Seeing this, Anderson stopped complaining and just asked. If my information is correct, it's probably an adult ice frost dragon, whose strength is roughly at sequence 4, but much weaker than a normal sequence 4, Roland said without hiding anything. Theoretically, with so many of us, plus the people in the book, it shouldn't be a big problem. Anderson was silent for a second upon hearing this, his gaze sweeping over everyone present, and finally he asked, are you sure? Although there were many people present, most of them were below the demigod level, and the gap between a demigod and low to mid-sequence beyonders could be said to be extremely exaggerated. Even 10 sequence 5 beyonders might be wiped out by a demigod. Of course, if they cooperated properly, it wasn't impossible to win. At least with Pales here, no one will die, Roland said with a smile. Alright, then I have no more questions. Anderson then shut up. As the strongest hunter in the Fog Sea, he truly didn't mind facing a demigod-level dragon without life-threatening danger. This was a rare experience. Since everyone is fine with it, I'll open the door. Roland flipped his hand, and a key appeared in his grasp. Roland then poked the key into the travels of Grossel, and accompanied by a blinding white light, everyone present, except for Katlia who had already retreated, disappeared and entered the world within the book. For the people in the world within the book, today was supposed to be a peaceful day. Giant Grossel, as always, mediated conflicts among his companions. He was a generous giant full of positive energy, and he didn't want his companions to hurt each other. Although elf singer Shattaz was very displeased with ascetic snowman, she still retracted the arrow pointed at ascetic snowman out of respect for giant Grossel. Ascetic snowman gave elf singer Shattaz an indifferent glance and then continued to pray to his lord. Their conflicts mainly stemmed from their beliefs. Elf singer Shattaz believed in the ancient god Elf King, while ascetic snowman believed in the ancient sun god. And as everyone knew, the death of the Elf King was inextricably linked to the ancient sun god. It could be said that their not having fought to the death was truly the result of so many years of shared life and death, as well as giant Grossel's diligent mediation. Mobit Zoroaster, whose clothing style was full of the asymmetrical characteristics of the Solomon Empire, shook his head at this scene. Then he sidled up to elf singer Shattaz and began to distract her with words, trying to make her happy. Then he was chased around the camp and beaten by the irritable elf singer Shattaz. But even so, there was still a subtle but real atmosphere between them. Perhaps it wouldn't be long before, when one of them bravely took that step, a couple would finally be united in marriage. Knight Longzor, clad in black armor, chose to sleep after this farce. He knew very well that if elf singer Shattaz and ascetic snowman had a slight chance of truly getting heated and causing things to spiral out of control, then elf singer Shattaz and Mobit Zoroaster were simply playing around. Perhaps, soon I can attend their wedding. But there's no priest here. We can't possibly let Snowman officiate the wedding, can we? Knight Longzor in black armor thought about that scene and couldn't help but gasp. And just when everyone thought today would be just another ordinary day, they suddenly heard a commotion, which made them all look in a certain direction. Then everyone froze, because in a certain direction, a large group of people was surging towards them. What's going on? It could be said that at this moment, no one was not bewildered. After all, although new people often arrived in this book, it was usually only 1 or 2 at a time, but now there were 7 or 8 people walking towards them. Everyone, be on guard. Elf singer Shattaz took the lead and drew her bow and arrow. Before knowing whether the newcomers were friends or foes, she had to be prepared to strike first. Wait, I think I saw the old man. Mobit Zoroaster, however, raised his hand in disbelief and rubbed his eyes. He looked at the familiar figure in the crowd not far away, his expression momentarily dazed. An acquaintance of yours. Elf singer Shattaz glanced at him, then she seemed to think of something and also froze. As companions who had lived together in the book for so many years, elf singer Shattaz had, of course, heard Mobit Zoroaster mention his family, among whom the most frequently mentioned was the old man he spoke of, who seemed to be an angel of the Zoroaster family. I'm not sure, but it really looks like the old man. Mobit Zoroaster again raised his hand to rub his eyes, confirming that he hadn't missing, wasn't dizzy, and it wasn't an illusion. His mood couldn't help but become excited, and he said, Shattaz, wait a moment. I'll go over there first to see. If there's a problem, then you can act. Elf singer Shattaz hesitated, then said, no, I'll go with you. All right. This time it was Mobit Zoroaster's turn to hesitate. Although he was highly confident that the person opposite was indeed the old man, there was always a possibility of an if. But Mobit Zoroaster also knew very well that he couldn't easily change elf singer Shattaz's decision, so he could only nod. Chapter 428 Pales puts on a monocle. Mobit Zoroaster hadn't seen his old man in a very long time, at least over 1,000 years by his reckoning. But this didn't mean Mobit Zoroaster would forget his memories related to Pales. After all, in this world of ice and snow, apart from his companions, past memories were the only true things Mobit Zoroaster possessed. They were the sole proof that Mobit Zoroaster had once lived in a vast world, and hadn't been born a resident of this strange book world. Mobit Zoroaster occasionally wondered if, should he truly forget his past one day, he would become like the residents of those books, turning into a shadow, a puppet. But Mobit Zoroaster had never truly hoped to leave the book world one day and return to the Zoroaster family. Perhaps, he had genuinely thought so at first. Mobit Soroyost had even considered how he would introduce his companions to his old man if Pales came to rescue him one day. After all, Mobit Soroyost had a bit of confidence in himself. He was, at least, a genius of the Zoroaster family, someone with a chance to become a demigod. Even to Pales, he was a relatively valued junior. For a junior like him to go missing, given Pales's character, he couldn't possibly just ignore it. However, no amount of confidence could withstand the erosion of time, especially after people from later generations entered this book world, and Mobit learned from Rosal that the fourth epoch had long ended, the Solomon Empire had fallen, and the other party had never heard of the Zoroaster family. Mobit then realized that he would never be able to go home in this life. Perhaps one day in the future, the story of the Frost Dragon would end, and they could truly leave this strange world. But by then, even if they did leave, they would only be returning to another unfamiliar world. What's more, Mobit always had a hidden worry. He knew very well that as a Sequence 5, he couldn't possibly live for over 1,000 years. The only reason he hadn't died yet was due to the unique nature of the book world. So, if the story truly ended one day and he returned to the outside world, would he immediately die from his lifespan running out? Mobit knew that he wasn't the only one who had considered this question. His companions weren't fools, even the forthright and direct giant Rosal had his sharp insights. But no one brought it up, because everyone wanted to go back. No one wanted to be buried in this strange book world, so even if the result of returning to the outside world was death, everyone still wanted to go back. On this point, even Mobit Soroyost shared the same thought. He was just a little regretful that Zoroaster was no longer around. Otherwise, he would definitely write a letter to the old man, asking a latercomer to deliver it to him, sharing his experiences of over 1,000 years in the book world, complaining about elf bard Shotasi's violence, and asking him to investigate the current situation of the elf race. Mobit knew that with Pales's keenness, he would definitely notice his hidden affections, which hadn't dissipated despite countless beatings. He might even scold him for being unpromising. But after scolding him, that old man, who was always soft-hearted towards his descendants, would surely help him investigate the elves' situation so Shotasi could finally return to her roots. But Mobit truly hadn't expected that today, when he had long given up hope, he would actually see someone who resembled Pales appear in the book world. Is this real? Or is it someone in disguise? Mobit Soroyost approached the crowd of people opposite him, feeling his heart pound faster and faster. When he was about 2 or 3 meters away from the group, Mobit Soroyost finally stopped. He was observing the few people opposite him and organizing his words, just about to say something, when suddenly his body stiffened. Because Mobit Soroyost saw that the 7 or 8 people opposite him all took out a monocle from their pockets at that moment and put it on their left eye. At this moment, Mobit Soroyost felt his body stiffen, but his heart was pounding violently. Some long-dormant fears resurfaced at this moment. Amon. It's Amon. No member of the Zoroaster family would not know Amon. That strange family could almost be called Zoroaster's mortal enemy. And as an outstanding young man of the Zoroaster family, Mobit Soroyost knew some secrets that ordinary family members didn't, such as the possibility that everyone in the Amon family was that time angel Amon. And for a Zoroaster, encountering Amon basically only had one outcome: death. At this moment, Mobit Soroyost thought of something. He thought of the downfall of the Solomon Empire, the decline of Zoroaster, and the terror of Amon. It was no exaggeration to say that at this moment, he even felt a little despair. Because Mobit couldn't be sure whether Amon appeared in the old man's form to play a prank, or if he had purely eaten and replaced the old man. Run, Shotasi, run. Mobit didn't know how he overcame his body's fear to shout this sentence. He could hear the fear in his own voice, but as he said it, he still stood in front of Shotasi without hesitation. Mobit, of course, knew that as a Sequence 5, he couldn't possibly block an angel, and Shotasi would also find it very difficult to truly escape. But he had to do this. He could only do this. Mobit, compared to Mobit's stress response, elf bard Shotasi clearly didn't know who Amon was. After all, Amon hadn't been born in her era. But elf bard Shotasi understood Mobit, so she could see his fear, and his resolve, a determination to stand out even when knowing it would lead to death. So in just an instant, she understood. The opponents were formidable, formidable enough to make Mobit despair. And with their strength, even facing a true sequence 4, they weren't without a fighting chance. So the opponent was at least a sequence 3, or even, a lesser deity. As a handmaiden to the elf queen, elf bard Shotasi was not ignorant. On the contrary, she was very clear about how powerful beings at sequence 2 and above were. They were existences she absolutely couldn't resist, and could even kill her with just a glance. Reason told her that running away at this moment was the best option, but before reason, elf bard Shotasi had already pulled Mobit, dragging him behind her, while simultaneously drawing her bow and nocking an arrow. Accompanied by a flash of electricity, the arrow in elf bard Shotasi's hand had already shot out. Shotasi, you, Mobit's eyes widened instantly. Chapter 429 The young couple finally got married. Chapter 429 The young couple finally become a family. Elf bard Shotasi continued to shoot arrows while glaring at him, scolding, "How could I abandon you and run away? You bastard, I'll deal with you later." Wow. Just as the atmosphere on the scene was gradually moving towards the direction of a young couple choosing to die together in the face of a strong enemy, one of the people opposite suddenly started applauding. That person not only applauded but also egged on those around him to applaud. For a moment, the atmosphere, which had just been so life and death, instantly became harmonious. After clapping a few times, Pales looked at Mobit and elf bard Shotasi with a teasing gaze and joked, "Not bad, Mobit. When are you getting married? This old man can't wait to attend your wedding." Mobit. Elf bard Shotasi. Mobit finally realized something. He looked at the people opposite, who were all taking off their glasses, and tentatively asked, "Old man, is it really you? Otherwise, what did you think?" Pales glanced at him and asked with a chuckle, "You didn't really think that a sequence 5 like you, encountering a true Amon, would still have the chance to play the hero just now, did you? Were all your previous lessons in vain?" Mobit immediately blushed and stammered, That's not how you should put it. The main body is very malicious. It's not impossible for it to want to play with Mobit and deliberately give him a chance to show off," little Amon objected. Hearing this, Mobit was taken aback. He looked at little Amon, and when he saw the monocle on her face, a hint of suspicion arose in his heart. He tentatively asked, "May I ask who you are?" "Hello there, I am the tiny time angel, and you can also call me little Amon," little Amon greeted him enthusiastically. When Mobit heard this answer, his heart sank, and he immediately looked at Pales, seeking confirmation. "Old man, is what she said true? She is indeed a clone of Amon." Pales did not deny it. He nodded, and seeing Mobit's astonished expression, he couldn't help but smile, then continued, "But you don't need to be nervous. Times have changed. This is no longer the era when Amon could do as he pleased." Hearing this, Mobit was clearly surprised and somewhat confused. He hesitated, looking at Pales a few times, appearing somewhat uncertain. What? Doubting this old man's identity? Pales glanced at Mobit, easily discerning what he was thinking. He wasn't angry, just chuckled, and then suddenly began recounting Mobit's various embarrassing childhood stories. Bedwetting, cross-dressing, drinking ink, and so on. Enough, I believe you are the old man now." Mobit's face turned green as he listened, and he quickly called for a stop. In fact, even if Pales revealed these embarrassing stories, it couldn't fully prove his identity, as theoretically, if Amon completely replaced Pales, he could also know these things. But first, Mobit Soroyost had some confidence in his ancestor's ability to preserve his life. The old man might not be Amon's opponent, but it would certainly not be easy for Time Angel to completely devour the old man. Secondly, Mobit was very clear that even if the other party was truly Amon, since the other party was willing to wear the old man's disguise and act out this scene with him, then he had to cooperate and continue the act. This way, at least he could still think about whether there was any turning point, any way to escape, instead of being directly eaten as a snack. Pales naturally saw what Mobit Soroyost was thinking, but he also truly didn't plan to continue explaining. After all, this chain of suspicion couldn't be resolved by explanation. Once they left the world of books, and he solved the other party's lifespan problem, Mobit would no longer have any doubts. After all, Amon would not do such a thankless task. "Mobit, what exactly is going on?" Elf Bard Shotasi, who was beside him, finally couldn't help but ask. She was utterly bewildered by this sudden turn of events. Mobit didn't know how to explain for a moment. Although he roughly guessed that this might just be the old man playing a prank on him, it was hard to say it directly. Although he didn't say it, seeing his stammering appearance, combined with what had just happened, Elf Bard Shotasi immediately guessed the truth. Her face instantly turned cold, and thinking of a certain possibility, she looked at Mobit and said, "You did it on purpose." "How could that be?" Mobit quickly and loudly defended himself. "I didn't even know the old man would come earlier, how could I conspire with him to deceive you?" "Shotasi, you have to believe me." HMPH. Elf Bard Shotasi snorted, neither confirming nor denying, but her expression improved somewhat. She merely said, "You might not have deliberately conspired with him to deceive me, but is there a possibility that you saw through it but deliberately pretended not to?" "There's absolutely no such possibility. I really thought I had encountered Amon just now. I didn't expect him to be the old man in disguise." Mobit quickly defended his innocence. In his haste, he blurted out, "Shotasi, believe me, I like you so much, how could I lie to you about something like this?" Mobit's voice abruptly stopped as he suddenly realized what he had said. The anger on Elf Bard Shotasi's face also subsided at this moment. She thought about what had just happened, Mobit's reaction in the face of danger, and her own body that had chosen to stay before reason. Elf Bard Shotasi suddenly ground her teeth. Perhaps it was a telepathic connection. Mobit also thought of everything that had just happened at this moment. This made him look at Elf Bard Shotasi and tentatively said, "Speaking of which, just now, Shotasi, you." "Shut up." Elf Bard Shotasi glared at him unhappily, then said in a dangerous tone, "I haven't settled the score with you for just now. Playing the hero, huh? Telling me to run away alone, huh?" Mobit immediately gave an awkward laugh, then said, "Shotasi, calm down, don't hit me. The old man is still here. It's not good to be so violent in front of an elder." Pales, who had been enjoying the junior's commotion, spoke at this moment. "Mobit, you can't say that. When young couples argue and get physical, there's never been a rule for elders to interfere." "No, old man, you misunderstood. Shotasi and I are not." Mobit was about to explain when he saw Elf Bard Shotasi's expression turn even colder, so he immediately changed his words. "No, we are a couple." HMPH. Elf Bard Shotasi sneered, then she drew her bow and notched an arrow. An arrow carrying an electric current shot towards Mobit. "No, then are we or aren't we? Why are you angry again?" Mobit asked, somewhat aggrieved, as he ran. His answer was more arrows sticking into his backside. A few minutes later, Mobit stopped running, and Elf Bard Shotasi also stopped shooting arrows. However, the former's backside was covered in arrows, making him look like a hedgehog. But judging by Mobit's grimace, yet his condition not worsening much, these arrows were clearly more of a lesson than a real attack. Elf Bard Shotasi looked at Mobit, her expression suddenly serious, and said, "In the elven race, you at least need to prepare a bouquet of flowers before proposing." Mobit froze. He realized something and stared blankly at Elf Bard Shotasi. Chapter 430. The growth of the Zoroast family. Flowers, yes, I should prepare flowers. How can a confession be without flowers? I'll go find flowers now. Mobit Soroyost, who had finally reacted after a moment of stunned, seemed to be completely dumbfounded. His movements became incoordinated, and before he had walked 2 steps, he was pulled back by Elf Bard Shotasi. She said, annoyed, "So many people are here. Now is not the time for you to look for flowers." After Elf Bard Shotasi finished speaking, she ignored him, her ears slightly red. She then looked somewhat uncomfortably at the crowd watching the fun, and after a slight pause, her gaze fell on Pales, saying, "You must be the Pales that Mobit mentioned. Please forgive Mobit and me for our rudeness just now. May I ask why you have come here?" Her attitude was respectful, yet neither obsequious nor arrogant. The respect was for an angel, and the lack of obsequiousness or arrogance was because the other party was not an elf angel. "It's nothing, I don't mind. How could I not understand this kid? As for my purpose for coming here, it is, of course, to save you all," Pales said with a chuckle. Elf Bard Shotasi pursed her lips when she heard this, but her expression was not one of surprise. When Mobit heard Pales's words, he no longer cared about finding flowers and quickly looked at Pales, saying, "Old man, can you take us out directly?" "Strictly speaking, it's not me," Pales shook his head and looked at Roland, who was watching the show next to him. Roland blinked, and facing the gazes from Mobit and Elf Bard Shotasi, he smiled and said, I can indeed open the door and take you out now, but perhaps you would prefer to bring an end to this experience rather than just leaving this world directly. You mean killing the King of the North? Mobit was not stupid and immediately guessed this point. Yes. Roland nodded, smiling, don't you want to settle things with that dragon? Especially with Pales here, this process will be very safe. Mobit's expression immediately showed obvious excitement. He had been trapped in this world for 1,000 years, fighting the King of the North for 1,000 years, so he was naturally unwilling to leave just like that. If there was no Pales as a guarantee, Mobit might choose to leave directly. After all, fighting the King of the North was not easy, and Mobit could not guarantee whether there would be casualties during the process. But now with the old man as a backup, Mobit almost instinctively looked at Pales, his gaze both eager and seeking confirmation. I guarantee no one will die in this battle, except for that dragon you mentioned, Pales said with a chuckle, like a kind old man, but no one would doubt his words. Before an angel, the King of the North, who was not even a true Sequence 4, was just a toy. Mobit, who had received the old man's guarantee, instantly felt his scales tip, but he did not immediately agree. Instead, he glanced at Shattaz, and after exchanging glances and communicating through their eyes, Mobit looked at Pales and said, I still need to consult with my other companions about this. Don't tell me that, it's not up to me. Pales shook his head, correcting him, and said, you should tell Jack. Although Jack Jones was just an ordinary faceless, Pales had never underestimated this junior. After all, he was Lucifer's student. And Lucifer, thinking of this descendant of the Zoroaster family, Pales couldn't help but sigh, then added, Jack is Lucifer's student, and Lucifer is the one who instructed me to save you. Upon hearing this, Mobit was first stunned, then looked at Roland and said enthusiastically, so that's how it is. In that case, friend, you are the student of my savior, so you are also my benefactor. While speaking, Mobit was actually a bit puzzled. He could sense that Pales's attitude was a bit unusual when he said those words, but this unusualness didn't seem to come from other emotions. Instead, it was because of guilt. Could it be that the old man had done something to displease Mr. Lucifer? Mobit couldn't help but speculate in his heart. There's no need to be so polite. The main reason my teacher asked Pales to save you was because of a deal, Roland said with a smile. He paused, then added, after all, my teacher doesn't really like Mr. Pales. Mobit. Huh. At this moment, Mobit felt a bit bewildered. He looked at Roland, then at Pales, and for a moment, he couldn't figure out what kind of relationship these people had. Pales, on the other hand, sighed. Facing Mobit's puzzled gaze, he explained, Lucifer is also a Zoroaster. He suffered a lot because of Amon. It's my fault. Mobit instantly felt that he understood, and then he realized something, and his gaze towards Roland became much friendlier. After all, a Zoroaster student could also be considered a member of the Zoroaster, and by rounding up, he was practically family. There's no need to round up. In fact, from a bloodline perspective, I am indeed a Zoroaster. Roland glanced at Mobit, seeing what the other party was thinking, he smiled and said. He had never hidden his bloodline. After all, Roland didn't mind revitalizing the Zoroaster family. Counting it, Pales had already been strengthened by him, and now he had gained Mobit Zoroast. Adding Lucifer, Jack, and Roland, their Zoroaster family was truly flourishing. The number of family members was about to exceed the fingers of one hand. Although 3 of them were his aliases, how was this not a revitalization? Roland was righteous about this. Mobit looked at him twice after hearing Roland's words, then said enthusiastically, no wonder I thought you looked familiar at first glance. Your family, brother. Let me introduce myself, I'm Mobit Zoroast. If you don't mind, just call me Mobit. Before I entered this damned world, I wasn't much older than you, so I won't presume to call myself your elder brother. Mobit was not stupid. He could naturally tell that Mr. Lucifer was not simple, most likely another angel, or even a more powerful existence than the old man. In such a situation, the identity of his student was self-evident. Therefore, Mobit would never rely on his seniority to act superior, that would be the act of a fool. I am Jack Jones, you can just call me Jack. Roland glanced at him and smiled, then continued, you can go ask your companions for their opinions. If anyone doesn't want to participate in the final battle and just wants to leave directly, I can open the door and send him out individually. Mobit was stunned for a moment, then realized that the other party was answering his previous question, and quickly said gratefully, thanks, brother, you're really a good person. After a pause, Mobit remembered something and said, then, shall we all go to the camp with me? I'll introduce you to my companions and inform them of the relevant situation. Roland naturally nodded in agreement. Then, the group walked towards the camp. During this process, everyone also exchanged names and introduced themselves. Red Maid, which genius gave you that title? Mobit was clearly a very talkative person, constantly chatting with others on the way. After asking about Danitz's title, Mobit was stunned for a moment and couldn't help but exclaim. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 431, Pales's well-meaning intentions for Leonard. Danitz timidly glanced in Roland's direction. Roland smiled back at him, then looked at Mobit Soroyost, and said with a smile, I came up with that name. Don't you think it has a very hunter pathway characteristic? Mobit's expression immediately turned strange, and he couldn't help but say, I can understand the codename, Red, but, maid, I really can't connect hunters with gentle maids. What's the relationship between them? That only shows you don't understand the hunter pathway well enough. Roland pinched his chin and immediately began to explain the characteristics of the hunter pathway to Mobit Soroyost, mainly focusing on the story of the favored Red Nanny Medici, which left Mobit dumbfounded. I have indeed heard some gossip, but I always thought it was fake. Mobit's face was a mix of two emotions at this moment, fear of being beaten and eagerness to hear gossip. He swallowed hard before saying, mainly, Lord Medici really doesn't look like the type of person who would take care of children. Mobit had seen Red Angel before. Although he was far from knowing him personally, as an excellent Zoroaster, Mobit had indeed been fortunate enough to see Red Angel from afar once. The majesty and pride on him left a deep impression on Mobit. It was precisely because of this that Mobit couldn't imagine such a man taking care of children. That's just your stereotype. Little Red is very good at taking care of people. Gehrman, Xiao Amon, and I were all taken care of by him before. Roland shook his head, ruthlessly corrupting Medici's image. That's right, Mama Little Red is very good at taking care of people. He's a man who can be my mother. Xiao Amon, who was nearby, immediately chimed in, adding to Little Red's strange reputation, and even tugged at the silent Little K beside him, saying, right, Gehrman. Little K. I'm sorry, Mr. Medici. Mr. Medici is indeed very good at taking care of others. Little K repented in his heart while using the gentlest possible description. With three people speaking from experience, and the old man next to them not denying it, Mobit Soroyost momentarily believed Roland's words. While feeling incredulous, he also worried that he would be silenced. After all, the people in front of him were clearly close to Lord Medici, so they could talk about such things casually, but he was just an ordinary Zoroaster. Thinking of this, Mobit couldn't help but look at Pales beside him. Don't worry, Medici won't bother with this kind of thing, as long as you don't spread rumors. Pales reassured his descendant, perfectly concealing the fact that he himself was also enjoying the gossip. After all, even Pales wasn't fully aware of all the gossip about King of Angels. Hearing this, Mobit Soroyost breathed a sigh of relief, but he didn't dare to continue discussing the topic, fearing that a certain Red Angel would suddenly appear and burn him to ashes. So Mobit Soroyost decided to change the subject. His eyes darted around a few times, as if he had thought of something. He curiously glanced at Leonard, who was next to Pales, and asked, Old man, is this your current student? His tone was filled with doubt and disbelief. Leonard, who was suddenly called upon, suddenly had a bad premonition in his heart. As expected, the next second he heard Pales sigh and say, no choice, even though he's an idiot, who told him he had good luck. Leonard. He knew it. Old man. Leonard finally couldn't help but retort, how am I an idiot? How are you not an idiot? Pales glanced at Leonard and said with a chuckle, one must know oneself. Do you think you are very smart? Leonard was stumped for a few seconds by the question, then he thought of something and said, I'm indeed not a particularly smart person, but I'm not an idiot either. Hee hee. Pales chuckled twice, then became uncharacteristically serious and said, compared to ordinary people, you are indeed not considered an idiot, and can even be considered a bit clever. But Leonard, you are my student, you are a Leziran Club member, and your best friend is close to many angels. In this situation, if you're not smart enough, then you're an idiot. Pales looked at Leonard. He sighed and said, I hope you are a smart person, so that even if something unexpected happens to me or your friends in the future, you can protect yourself. But I also know that you are not smart enough. And a person who is not smart enough, if they try to act smart, it's better to just be a fool. Pales seemed to recall something as he said this, his expression a little sad. He continued, fortunately, you are indeed an idiot who doesn't like to use his brain. This is also good. You won't get dragged deeper into those matters. Leonard fell silent. He had never expected Pales to think this way. He had always thought that Pales enjoyed mocking his intelligence and used it to pressure him to study. He never thought that Pales was actually thinking about his safety, which made him feel a little touched. Old man, you. However, Leonard's emotion didn't last for even a second before he heard Pales chuckle and continue. But even though your intellectual shortcomings are irreparable, fortunately, your knowledge shortcomings can still be somewhat compensated. It just so happens that Mobit also missed over 1,000 years of lessons. Later, you two can come to me for tutoring. Leonard's expression immediately froze. Mobit also seemed to recall something, showing an unpleasant expression. He hesitated, then looked at Pales and said, Old man, I'm already over 1,000 years old. What's wrong with being over 1,000 years old? The sun god next door is thousands of years old and still studying with the god of knowledge. How old are you? You're not even a demigod, and you already want to avoid studying. Pales glanced at Mobit Soroyast and said with a chuckle. Mobit was immediately suppressed by his great-grandfather. Elf Bard Shotasi, hearing a certain keyword, twitched her ears and looked at Pales with some confusion, but ultimately said nothing. The group quickly arrived at the camp amidst such chatter. Naturally, someone was already waiting there. The two sides quickly met, and Mobit acted as an intermediary to introduce them. When Amon was introduced, the others had no reaction, but Ascetic Snowman suddenly raised his head. He clearly knew what that name represented. After carefully scrutinizing Amon for a few moments, his expression became more excited than ever before. Are you Lord Time Angel? His voice trembled with disbelief. Amon was stunned to hear this. He looked at Ascetic Snowman, seemed to think of something, pursed his lips, then sighed, but did not refute. He did not separate himself from his main body as he had before, but nodded and said, It is I. Amon looked at him and said seriously, Snowman, you have done very well all these years. Now, by the command of the Sun God, I have come to take you home. Lord. Oh, Lord, Ascetic Snowman at this moment found it hard to describe his feelings. It was probably like someone who had lived in darkness for a long time finally seeing a ray of light. He bowed to Amon, his voice incredibly devout, saying, Your will is my desire. Image. Problematic ad. Report it here. Number 433 Secrets of the King of the North. AI Model. Gemini -2.0 Flash. Chapter 432 The Secret of the King of the North. Chapter 432 The Northern King's Secret. After the small interlude where Ascetic Snowman was so excited by little Amon's words he almost fainted, the remaining people naturally continued with their self-introductions. After everyone had gotten to know each other, Mobit Soroyast then asked his companions if they intended to leave the book world directly, or if they decided to kill the Northern King and bring their story to a close before leaving the book world. Without exception, everyone trapped in the book world chose to go kill the Northern King. They had been entangled with this giant dragon for too long. Even Roland, who had most recently entered the book world, had been dealing with this frost giant dragon for over 100 years. To ask them to leave just like that would be truly unwilling. Since that's the case, let's go slay the dragon. Roland saw that everyone's opinions were consistent, so he decisively made the decision. Then, as if sensing something, he looked up in a certain direction and smiled, saying, it's here. Just as the final battle between the hero and the evil dragon is bound to happen at the end of a dragon-slaying story, after these outsiders converged with the people in the camp, it clearly triggered certain mechanisms of the book's events, causing the Northern King, this great boss in the book, to proactively come to them. Amidst the raging blizzard, a colossal frost giant dragon, entirely ice blue in color, flew in from a distance. What a beautiful dragon, I love its scales. Little Amon looked up at the giant dragon about to descend from the sky, his eyes slightly gleaming, and then said with a touch of regret, too bad it's fake. It is a bit of a pity. Roland also observed the giant dragon in the sky, nodding in agreement with little Amon's assessment. In terms of appearance, this dragon's scales were indeed very beautiful. Just as the two were commenting on the giant dragon, the Northern King finally descended, accompanied by the spitting of ice-blue flames. Little K, with quick eyes and hands, dodged with a side lunge, avoiding the ice-blue flames that seemed capable of freezing everything. While preparing for battle, he didn't forget to glance at the position of his companion. Neither Little Amon nor Jack were pushovers. One appeared behind the dragon at some unknown point, slightly exaggeratedly patting his chest as if he had been startled. The other remained in place, but red flames, completely opposite to the ice-blue flames, surged from his body. As soon as these red flames appeared, they actually ignited the flames spewed by the Northern King in reverse, and followed these flames all the way up. The Northern King immediately wanted to stop spewing flames, but before it could act, Little Amon, who was behind it, snapped his fingers. This caused the Northern King's movements to pause. It actually forgot what it wanted to do and was burned by the red flames in an instant. These flames were clearly overbearing, causing the Northern King to roll repeatedly, using all sorts of methods, yet unable to extinguish even a bit. It was so bad that one could almost smell roasted meat. Oh no, we can't just burn it to death. Roland said this while casually twirling the pendant around his neck. It was a Beander item containing Medici's power. With his action, the flames on the Northern King, which had just been roasted almost cooked, finally extinguished. At this moment, the Northern King was far, far more miserable than when it had majestically appeared. The entire dragon's aura was dispirited. This series of sudden changes clearly stunned the other people present. Roland then glanced at them at this moment and said with a smile, "It's been weakened, aren't you going to attack?" The others immediately exchanged glances. The next second, without any hesitation, Jay Luosire the giant pulled out his greatsword, and elf singer Shattus's body flickered with electricity, already drawing her bow and nocking an arrow. The others also charged forward, beginning to unleash a furious assault on the Northern King. Roland, at this moment, did not participate. After all, he was just an unremarkable faceless with no output capability. Roland simply retreated to the side, paying attention to the situation there while raising his hand. In his hand was an ice-blue scale. This scale clearly came from the Northern King. Just now, Roland wasn't just roasting it with flames, he was also taking the opportunity to probe this special giant dragon. After all, Roland had always been very curious about what the Northern King, as the only designated boss in the story, truly was in this book world. Was it an unimportant cover like the others, or did it have some special qualities? And after probing just now, Roland also confirmed that the Northern King was indeed a bit special. It was closely related to the core of this world. Roland even suspected whether it was, to a certain extent, a symbol of dragon of imagination. Deliberately making the Divine Kingdom into such a book, letting people enter it for adventures, and arranging the giant dragon as the final boss, guiding others to kill it, Roland looked up at the Northern King, who was currently being besieged, and suddenly narrowed his eyes, muttering in his heart, "Is it part of a resurrection ritual? Dragon of imagination is dead, having died under the Sun God's crusade. The Northern Dragon is also about to die, dying under the Adventurer's crusade. So, if one day in the future, the Northern Dragon revives, will it affect Dragon of Imagination?" Roland, of course, knew that Dragon of Imagination's contingency plan in Grossel's travels was related to 008. Theoretically, as long as 008 encountered Grossel's travels, Dragon of Imagination could revive through 008, and then use the negative personality sealed in Grossel's travels to control the Chaos Sea, gaining the power to contend with Adam. But this is an audience, after all, who stipulated that his resurrection method could only be one. This scale, Little Amon, who had somehow disengaged from the battle, came up to Roland. He frowned as he looked at the scale in Roland's palm, hesitatingly saying, "I feel it's a bit dangerous." It is a key, the key to unlocking the true secrets of this world. Roland didn't hide anything, simply introducing it, saying, I will give it to teacher, perhaps it can bring us some surprises. Little Amon showed a thoughtful expression. He hesitated for a moment, then asked in a low voice, is it related to Father's resurrection? Yes, Roland nodded, then looked at Little Amon and asked with a smile, at least it will have some reference value. Little Amon's expression clearly brightened upon hearing this. While they were chatting, the boss battle there had already reached its end. Even the Northern King in the original work was successfully killed when facing Klein and others. Now, the Northern King, half dead from being roasted by Roland, was even less of a match for Little K and the others. Just as Little K was about to use marionettist skill to transform the Northern King into a marionette, he suddenly heard Jack's voice. Wait, Gehrman. Little K's movements paused. Although a bit puzzled, he still stopped the final transformation of the Northern King. He looked at Roland, who had walked to the side, and asked, what's wrong? The situation has changed a bit, it's best not to kill it, Roland explained simply. He looked at the dying giant dragon in front of him, thought for a moment, then pulled out a charm from his arms and activated it directly on the giant dragon. Seal. This was precisely a charm made by Bethel to seal others. So, with the activation of the charm, the Northern King's body immediately changed. In just an instant, it transformed into a statue, as if time and space had solidified on it. Chapter 432, The Northern King's Secret. After the small interlude where ascetic Snowman was so excited by Little Amon's words he almost fainted, the remaining people naturally continued with their self-introductions. After everyone had gotten to know each other, Mobit Soroyast then asked his companions if they intended to leave the book world directly, or if they decided to kill the Northern King and bring their story to a close before leaving the book world. Without exception, everyone trapped in the book world chose to go kill the Northern King. They had been entangled with this giant dragon for too long. Even Roland, who had most recently entered the book world, had been dealing with this frost giant dragon for over 100 years. To ask them to leave just like that would be truly unwilling. Since that's the case, let's go slay the dragon. Roland saw that everyone's opinions were consistent, so he decisively made the decision. Then, as if sensing something, he looked up in a certain direction and smiled, saying, "Ah, it's here." Just as the final battle between the hero and the evil dragon is bound to happen at the end of a dragon-slaying story, after these outsiders converged with the people in the camp, it clearly triggered certain mechanisms of the book's events, causing the Northern King, this great boss in the book, to proactively come to them. Amidst the raging blizzard, a colossal frost giant dragon, entirely ice blue in color, flew in from a distance. What a beautiful dragon, I love its scales. Little Amon looked up at the giant dragon about to descend from the sky, his eyes slightly gleaming, and then said with a touch of regret, too bad it's fake. It is a bit of a pity. Roland also observed the giant dragon in the sky, nodding in agreement with Little Amon's assessment. In terms of appearance, this dragon's scales were indeed very beautiful. Just as the two were commenting on the giant dragon, the Northern King finally descended, accompanied by the spitting of ice-blue flames. Little K, with quick eyes and hands, dodged with a side lunge, avoiding the ice-blue flames that seemed capable of freezing everything. While preparing for battle, he didn't forget to glance at the position of his companion. Neither Little Amon nor Jack were pushovers. One appeared behind the dragon at some unknown point, slightly exaggeratedly patting his chest as if he had been startled. The other remained in place, but red flames, completely opposite to the ice-blue flames, surged from his body. As soon as these red flames appeared, they actually ignited the flames spewed by the Northern King in reverse, and followed these flames all the way up. The Northern King immediately wanted to stop spewing flames, but before it could act, Little Amon, who was behind it, snapped his fingers. This caused the Northern King's movements to pause. It actually forgot what it wanted to do and was burned by the red flames in an instant. These flames were clearly overbearing, causing the Northern King to roll repeatedly, using all sorts of methods, yet unable to extinguish even a bit. It was so bad that one could almost smell roasted meat. "Oh no, we can't just burn it to death." Roland said this while casually twirling the pendant around his neck. It was a Beyonder item containing Medici's power. With his action, the flames on the Northern King, which had just been roasted almost cooked, finally extinguished. At this moment, the Northern King was far, far more miserable than when it had majestically appeared. The entire dragon's aura was dispirited. This series of sudden changes clearly stunned the other people present. Roland then glanced at them at this moment and said with a smile, "It's been weakened, aren't you going to attack?" The others immediately exchanged glances. The next second, without any hesitation, Zhe Luosire the giant pulled out his greatsword, and elf singer Shattus's body flickered with electricity, already drawing her bow and nocking an arrow. The others also charged forward, beginning to unleash a furious assault on the Northern King. Roland, at this moment, did not participate. After all, he was just an unremarkable faceless with no output capability. Roland simply retreated to the side, paying attention to the situation there while raising his hand. In his hand was an ice-blue scale. This scale clearly came from the Northern King. Just now, Roland wasn't just roasting it with flames, he was also taking the opportunity to probe this special giant dragon. After all, Roland had always been very curious about what the Northern King, as the only designated boss in the story, truly was in this book world. Was it an unimportant cover like the others, or did it have some special qualities? And after probing just now, Roland also confirmed that the Northern King was indeed a bit special. It was closely related to the core of this world. Roland even suspected whether it was, to a certain extent, a symbol of dragon of imagination. Deliberately making the divine kingdom into such a book, letting people enter it for adventures, and arranging the giant dragon as the final boss, guiding others to kill it, Roland looked up at the Northern King, who was currently being besieged, and suddenly narrowed his eyes, muttering in his heart, "Is it part of a resurrection ritual? Dragon of imagination is dead, having died under the Sun God's crusade. The Northern Dragon is also about to die, dying under the Adventurers' crusade. So, if one day in the future, the Northern Dragon revives, will it affect Dragon of imagination?" Roland, of course, knew that Dragon of Imagination's contingency plan in Grossel's travels was related to 008. Theoretically, as long as 008 encountered Grossel's travels, Dragon of Imagination could revive through 008, and then use the negative personality sealed in Grossel's travels to control the Chaos Sea, gaining the power to contend with Adam. But this is an audience, after all, who stipulated that his resurrection method could only be one. This scale, little Amon, who had somehow disengaged from the battle, came up to Roland. He frowned as he looked at the scale in Roland's palm, hesitatingly saying, "I feel it's a bit dangerous. It is a key, the key to unlocking the true secrets of this world." Roland didn't hide anything, simply introducing it, saying, "I will give it to teacher, perhaps it can bring us some surprises." Little Amon showed a thoughtful expression. He hesitated for a moment, then asked in a low voice, "Is it related to Father's resurrection?" "Yes," Roland nodded, then looked at little Amon and asked with a smile, "At least it will have some reference value." Little Amon's expression clearly brightened upon hearing this. While they were chatting, the boss battle there had already reached its end. Even the Northern King in the original work was successfully killed when facing Klein and others. Now, the Northern King, half dead from being roasted by Roland, was even less of a match for Little K and the others. Just as Little K was about to use marionettist skill to transform the Northern King into a marionette, he suddenly heard Jack's voice. "Wait, Gehrman." Little K's movements paused. Although a bit puzzled, he still stopped the final transformation of the Northern King. He looked at Roland, who had walked to the side, and asked, "What's wrong?" "The situation has changed a bit, it's best not to kill it," Roland explained simply. He looked at the dying giant dragon in front of him, thought for a moment, then pulled out a charm from his arms and activated it directly on the giant dragon. Seal. This was precisely a charm made by Bethel to seal others. So, with the activation of the charm, the Northern King's body immediately changed. In just an instant, it transformed into a statue, as if time and space had solidified on it. Chapter 433 Danitz doesn't want to study. "All right, it won't have another chance to harm you all," Roland said, looking at the others who were clearly a bit puzzled but didn't stop him, and explained, "I apologize, everyone, circumstances have changed. I need to hand this dragon over to my teacher for research, so I can't let you kill it." The others exchanged glances upon hearing this, and finally, Zhe Luosire, the giant, laughed heartily, "It's fine. Anyway, we've already defeated it. If you need it, take it. You deserve it. In Jay Luosire, the giant's opinion, if Roland hadn't weakened the Northern King at the start, it wouldn't have been so easy for them to defeat this dragon, let alone the fact that he came to rescue them. There was even less need to quibble over this. Thank you, Roland politely thanked him. Then, he thought of something and looked at Jay Luosire, the giant, saying, if you want to return to the giant royal court, I can help you, but the situation there is a bit special. Before the problem is resolved, you probably aren't suitable to go. Although Roland had already brought many people from City of Silver and Moon City out, the formal gate to the outside world in the giant royal court had not yet been opened, so the dark angel evil spirits there had naturally not been dealt with. Given Jay Luosire, the giant's sequence, it wasn't very suitable for him to go. Perhaps I should find some time to resolve the problem there. Anyway, I'm not afraid of the Chaos Sea's pollution. I'll bring Saucereer along then. Roland imagined the meeting of the two dark angels in his mind and found it somewhat amusing. Jay Luosire, the giant, on the other hand, became excited by Roland's words and said, really? You can send me back to the giant royal court. But you'll probably have to wait for a while, not too long. Once the problem there is resolved, I'll notify you, Roland nodded and said. Thank you, you're truly a good person. Jay Luosire, the giant, clearly didn't mind waiting a bit longer. After all, he had already waited for too long, so a little more time wouldn't make a difference. Roland smiled, then raised his hand and snapped his fingers, and a door emitting white light appeared before everyone. All right, since the boss has been defeated, it's time for us to leave this world. Roland thought of something else as he spoke and looked at the smiling Pales beside him. Pales, of course, hadn't forgotten the main business. After receiving Roland's gaze, he looked at Mobit Soroyost and the others, who were clearly excited, and said, don't rush to leave yet. I'll first resolve the small-time problem on you. On the future, as the door opened, figures walked out one by one. First Little K's trio, then Leonard and Pales, followed by two hunters, and then Mobit Soroyost and the others. Katlia, who had been waiting on the deck, curiously observed Mobit Soroyost and the others. Her gaze first fell on Jay Luosire, the giant, her expression showing a hint of amazement. Giants were very rare these days, or rather, acquired giants could still be seen, as the Church of the God of Combat existed, and many people walked the warrior pathway, which could qualify them as giant reserves. But innate giants had almost disappeared, perhaps they weren't extinct, but they no longer appeared before people. In the current northern and southern continents, at most, one could only see beings suspected of having giant bloodlines, such as people from the Faesak Empire who were generally believed to have giant ancestors. However, the giant bloodline in such beings was basically so diluted as to be negligible, incomparable to true giants. So, even Katlia was seeing a true pure-blooded giant for the first time in her life. The next second, Katlia's gaze fell on elf singer Shattaz, focusing on her slightly pointed ears, which she knew were characteristic of elves. Elves existed on some islands in the Five Seas, as many years ago, elves openly lived in the Five Seas. Many customs in the Five Seas today, such as the preference for eating spicy tripe hot pot, are customs left behind by elves. However, as time passed, the number of elves dwindled, and they gradually stopped appearing before people, but many places in the Five Seas still had mixed-blood humans with elf bloodlines, though some of these humans didn't even know they had elf blood. However, Katlia had seen a few elves, as she often traveled around the Five Seas. So, compared to her excitement at seeing a giant, Katlia's attitude towards the elves was much calmer. Aside from these two extraordinary races, the others were clearly pure-blooded humans. Katlia's gaze swept over them one by one, focusing on their distinct period clothing, secretly comparing them with the various historical clothing cultures she knew. This is Katlia, the captain of the future. For the next period, she will be responsible for teaching you some common knowledge about this era. If you have anything you want to know, you can also ask her, but I cannot guarantee she will answer, Roland said, introducing her to Mobit Soroyost and the others after casually closing the door to the book world. This wasn't a sudden whim of his, but something that had been decided beforehand. After all, Mobit Soroyost and the others had truly been trapped in the book world for too long and had long been out of touch with this world. Before officially returning to the world, some training was naturally necessary. Mobit Soroyost and the others looked at each other upon hearing this, and finally, everyone looked at Katlia. After some observation, no one raised any objections. Even elf singer Shattaz, the most irritable among them, knew that she had long been out of touch with this era and would certainly need to understand the current situation before returning to the world. And putting everything else aside, they first needed to learn the current common language, otherwise, they would truly be returning to the era as illiterates. So, a group of people followed Katlia to class, while Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg chose to bid farewell to everyone. She was clearly very satisfied with what she had gained from this trip to the future, and she seemed to be in a very good mood. After saying goodbye, she thought of something else and looked at Danitz, saying, "Danitz, since Mr. Jack wants you to continue as their guide, you should follow them for now. Don't worry, contact me if anything happens. I hope the next time I see you, you can become a formal conspirer." "Captain, I'll try my best." Danitz clearly didn't really want to stay, but looking at the encouraging gazes on the ship and thinking of the conspirer characteristic that Jack hadn't traded to him yet, Danitz ultimately didn't say, "I want to go back to the ship." "Don't worry, Ms. Edwina, we will definitely take good care of Danitz." Roland patted the somewhat dejected Danitz on the shoulder and smiled at Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg. "I naturally trust you." Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg nodded. Her gaze fell on Danitz, and she remembered something else, adding, "You've missed quite a few lessons recently. I'll send you a few books later, you can read them when you have time." Okay, Captain." Danitz forced a smile, but it looked worse than a cry. He never expected that even though he wasn't going back to the ship, he still couldn't escape studying. Chapter 434 Methods to Strengthen Shao Ke. Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg retracted her gaze. She wasn't unaware of Danitz's reluctance, but on one hand, she could tell that Roland himself had no ill will towards Danitz. On the contrary, this might even be Danitz's opportunity. With the wealth of Roland and others, Danitz's chance to become a Sequence 5 might very well lie here. Secondly, she had always known that Danitz's personality was the type that only moves forward with motivation. If he wasn't pushed, he might never be able to advance to a higher level in his life. As for any secret crushes, Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg didn't really care. She had no intention of falling in love and currently only wanted to learn more knowledge, understand more mysteries, and climb to higher levels on the Beander pathway to see more sights. Simply put, Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg was a career-driven intellectual. Vice Admiral Edwina the Iceberg left, but Anderson did not, as he was still counting on Roland to take him to see the God of Knowledge, so he had no plans to leave yet. Leonard and Pales did leave, mainly because Leonard's leave was limited, and he couldn't delay outside for too long, he had to go back to work. However, although Pales's main body left, he specifically left a clone on Mobit Soroyost, seemingly to supervise his studies. Although Roland felt that it was more likely because the old man wanted to watch the fun of his great-grandson, it could also be that he had finally regained a junior and was watching him more closely for a while. The three of them, Roland, Little K, and Xiao Amon, huddled together and whispered, "I will give Grossel's travels to my teacher. After my teacher finishes studying its mysteries, he might return it to us," Roland said, holding Grossel's travels. Little K and Xiao Amon naturally had no objections to this. Xiao Amon even wished Lucifer would fly over immediately, take the book, unlock its secrets, and resurrect the sun god. Little K didn't think that much. He just reviewed the battle with the Northern King while casually asking, "Where are we going next? If nothing unexpected happens, it's the City of Generosity, Byam," Roland said, and suddenly thought of something, his eyes lighting up. "Speaking of which, Gehrman, aren't you missing a marionettist? Why don't we try to turn the sea serpent Kvetchua into your marionettist?" Little K was stunned for a moment and pointed to himself uncertainly, saying, "I remember I'm only Sequence 5. And Kvetchua was already Sequence 3. But theoretically, a Sequence 5 marionettist can control a Sequence 3 demigod marionettist, can't he?" Roland asked with a smile. Little K hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Although it was very difficult, it was theoretically feasible, just as a shepherd can herd a Sequence 4. Theoretically, as long as a marionettist can convert the target into his marionettist, he can control it. But in reality, it's almost impossible. Just like earlier, if you hadn't weakened the Northern King beforehand, I'm afraid it would have been very difficult for me to control its spirit, Little K said truthfully. Whether a marionettist can convert a target into a marionettist mainly depends on the strength of the opponent's spirit. A powerful spirit can break free from the control of spirit body threads, making it naturally very difficult to convert it into a marionettist. However, once successfully converted, even a sequence 3 would indeed become a true marionettist. I'll figure out a way for that. You know, I have a lot of interesting little gadgets on me, Roland said with a smile. Little K's current sequence was still too low, but there was nothing he could do about it, as he had only been a Beander for too short a time. And now, although Roland didn't expect Little K to become the Lord of the Mysteries, he still hoped that Little K could play a significant role in the upcoming changes, which would help him complete the ritual and advance to Miracle Invoker in the future. And given that Little K's own sequence couldn't advance again in a short period, getting him a sequence 3 level marionettist might be a good choice. Out of pay attention to for Grossel's travels, Roland naturally quickly made his main account, Lucifer, take time to come to future and retrieve Grossel's travels from his alt account. It was also a coincidence that Lucifer arrived at a very opportune time, just as Mobit Soroyost, who had gotten a large bouquet of roses from somewhere, was loudly confessing his feelings to elf singer Shattaz on the deck. Roland raised an eyebrow, glanced at the two people confessing in the distance, then swept his gaze to the few heads peeking out from the corner, and didn't speak to disturb them. After all, Roland still had strong principles, he wouldn't do anything to ruin a marriage. Of course, if it was Tudor and the Primal Witch, who were both crazy, that would be another matter. Roland merely watched the progress of the confession with great interest, and saw elf singer Shattaz, after a few seconds of silence, take the bouquet of roses from Mobit Soroyost's hand. The next second, the roses were thrown aside, and the two embraced under the crimson moonlight, making the atmosphere on site exceptionally beautiful. Cough, over there, stop hiding. After embracing for a while, the two finally separated, but there were no further intimate actions. Mobit Soroyost just coughed a little awkwardly, looked at the corner where the onlookers were hiding, and spoke with a hint of helplessness. If you want to watch, just watch openly. It's not something shameful. Do you think I wouldn't let you watch? Elf singer Shattaz glanced at the onlookers and said grumpily. Haha, everyone's here. We just didn't want to disturb you. These flowers are very pretty. Mobit, I remember you said before that you didn't like Shattaz anymore. I didn't expect it to be this kind of not liking. When are you getting married? Do you need me to introduce a priest? The people in the corner came out one by one, some awkward, some happy, and some teasing, but regardless of their expressions, everyone then congratulated the new couple. Pales's clone, who appeared out of nowhere, patted Mobit Soroyost on the shoulder and said earnestly, marry soon, have children soon. Now Zoroaster is waiting for you to spread your branches and leaves. This was the plain truth. Although there were certainly still lost Zoroaster bloodlines in the world, on the surface, there were only a handful of people still using the surname Zoroaster. Among them, Pales himself was old and certainly couldn't marry and have children again, and there was no hope from Roland's side. So, it could only be up to Mobit Soroyost to have more children and spread the family line. Cough, that certainly depends on what Shattaz thinks, Mobit Soroyost replied, blushing, while secretly glancing at elf singer Shattaz. Elf singer Shattaz's expression didn't change much, but her ears were also slightly red, probably because she had never been urged by an elder like this before. Chapter 435, Hopefully Not God. Pales's incarnation then teased the young couple a few more times before finally presenting his congratulatory gift, a Sequence 5 Marauder Pathway characteristic, and several high-level charms. Everyone else also offered their congratulations, most of which were not expensive, but generally represented their heartfelt intentions. Roland naturally followed suit and gave the young couple a gift. He then arranged for his small account to rest, while his main account left with Grossel's travels. Is this the book you mentioned? Medici's gaze fell on the book Roland brought back. He was already accustomed to Roland always bringing back large items whenever he went out. After a few glances, he said, it doesn't look like anything special. That's normal. If its specialness were so easy to discern, it wouldn't have been lost, Roland smiled and looked at Medici, saying, "Next, I'm going to explore its true secrets within this book. Why don't you come with me?" Roland genuinely hoped to research something from Grossel's travels. For example, the Dragon of Imagination's method of revival using 008 is actually very similar to the Sun God's revival on Adam and the True Creator. However, the Sun God's revival had a huge flaw, directly splitting into two halves. Roland was very curious if the Dragon of Imagination's revival method also had the same flaw. And if the Dragon of Imagination's revival method had no flaw of will splitting, aside from a drop in sequence, then it would be very valuable for Roland's reference. Medici glanced at Roland, didn't refuse, and nodded, saying, "All right, I also want to see what secrets are hidden inside." Even if Roland hadn't mentioned it, Medici would have proposed going in with him. Firstly, as he said, out of curiosity, and secondly, to protect Roland. After all, in his regular state, the other party was just an ordinary king of angels. This book, The City of Calamities, will on Medici's shoulder stared at the book for a few seconds, then showed a thoughtful expression. Roland glanced at him and suddenly said, "What, do you feel the power of God?" The Dragon of Imagination also faced the trouble of God's revival within him back then, and because of this, it wouldn't be surprising if his post-revival contingency had some traces of God. Who knew if the sealed negative personality of the Dragon of Imagination wasn't mixed with the negative personality of God? A little, but not very similar. The City of Calamities did not deny it, nodding. His biggest gain during this period was, don't be stubborn and don't be rude, so facing Roland's inquiry, he naturally appeared well behaved. Roland raised an eyebrow at that. He then smiled, flipped his palm, and the key to entering the book world appeared in his palm. Roland said, "Whether it is or not, we'll know once we go in and see." Medici naturally had no objections to this, and the City of Calamities was not entitled to an opinion. Thus, the world within the book, which had only recently received visitors, welcomed guests once again. Unlike the original story where the world after the story ended transformed into an ancient city of ice and snow, because Roland intervened to prevent the Northern King's death, the world within the book still maintained the state it was in when Roland and the others left. And the landing point for Roland and Medici was precisely where the sealed Northern King was located. "Xiao Zai, can you feel its specialness?" Roland glanced at the cat on Medici's shoulder and suddenly asked. The City of Calamities poked out his cat head and stared at the Northern King for a few seconds. He suddenly jumped onto the other party's body, ran a few laps on the solidified giant dragon, and finally stopped on the giant dragon's head. The City of Calamities looked at Roland and said, "Did you take something?" Of course. Roland didn't deny it. He nodded and walked to the side of the giant dragon, the ice-blue dragon scale already appearing in his hand. Roland held the scale, and as Nyarlathotep's power was injected, a white light burst forth. Immediately after, the entire world seemed to change in an instant. The world seemed to disappear for a moment at this instant, then reassembled in the next second, but the reassembled world was no longer that icy, snowy scene, but had become a city. It was a city with a grayish-white foundation, very majestic, and its size didn't look like it was for human habitation, but rather more like a city for large creatures like dragons. City of Miracles, Levaheed. Medici looked at the not too unfamiliar city before him and raised an eyebrow. Roland also surveyed the dragon city before him. After staring at it for a while, he commented, "It seems the Dragon of Imagination's aesthetic is better than Adam's. This city looks even more breathtaking than the White Bone Cathedral." Medici glanced at him, didn't refute, and nodded, saying, "This is the Dragon of Imagination's only commendable aspect." The City of Calamities listen to the two of them critiquing the Dragon of Imagination's aesthetics, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He could only continue gazing at the city before him. After watching for a while, he spoke, "I feel the power of the Chaos Sea. Something contaminated by the Chaos Sea should be sealed here." Roland heard this and glanced at the City of Calamities. He wasn't surprised by the remark. He also looked at the city before him and said with a smile, "That's the second personality cut out by the Dragon of Imagination. I hope there isn't any component of that old man god mixed in. I really don't want to see him." Hearing Roland's words, the City of Calamities shook the fur on his body and said nothing. Because he also didn't really want to see God, even if it wasn't God's main body, but just an incarnation of his will. Whether it is or isn't, we'll know once we go in and see. Medici glanced at them and then stepped towards the city before them. They naturally weren't aimlessly wandering, but rather proceeded in the direction where they sensed the chaos sea's contamination, and soon arrived at a grand hall. Disgusting power. Medici narrowed his eyes, instantly noticing the peculiarity of this hall. That's right, they had arrived at the city hall, where everyone's inner thoughts would be presented in spoken language, which is why it was also called the social death hall. Of course, while it was said to be for everyone, this was after all only the residual power of the dragon of imagination. To read the thoughts of Medici, who had now mastered the power of the city of calamity and could be considered an king of angels among king of angels, was still a bit lacking. If Medici had been completely unprepared, his thoughts would likely have been successfully read, but with his guard up, the Hall of Honesty clearly failed. Roland, meanwhile, waited with interest for his thoughts to be read. He never felt there was anything shameful about his thoughts. Unfortunately, after waiting for a long time, he didn't hear any sound, and immediately showed a disappointed expression. That's enough. Don't you know what you are? Medici glanced at Roland, as sarcastic as ever. As for the city of calamity's will, as a primordial existence, even if he was just an incarnation, he could not be read by the dragon of imagination's residual power. Even the dragon of imagination himself would have a hard time. How boring. It really is less interesting coming here when you're at a higher sequence. Roland pouted, deciding that next time he'd trick little K and the others into coming. He then looked towards the depths of the hall, and after walking a bit further, he predictably saw a door. It was a bronze door inscribed with countless mysterious runes, seemingly sealing something. The door was tightly shut at this moment, not open as it was in the original work. Chapter 436 God provides inspiration. Is this difference because the story isn't over yet, or because we're not welcome here? Roland raised an eyebrow at the tightly shut bronze door in front of him. He didn't mind this small change, but instead walked excitedly to the door and placed his hand on it. His power seeped through the door, exploring the world within little by little, swiftly and secretly. Soon, Roland's eyes lit up. He then raised his hand, tapped the door a few times, and said with a smile, "Is anyone home?" The Calamity City will on Medici's shoulder had a subtle expression, probably thinking of some not-so-distant memories. There was no response from within the door, only dead silence. Thump, thump, thump. So Roland knocked on the door a few more times and continued, "If you're there, make a sound, otherwise I'll notify the sun god to kick the door down." At this moment, there was finally movement within the door. A voice said, "The sun god has long since fallen. As for Adam or the true creator, I don't think they can be considered the sun god." It sounded ethereal and eerie, as if countless voices were mixed together. And the moment he heard this voice, Roland felt a power trying to stir his soul. If this power succeeded, it would probably make him develop a second personality or something. However, it was clear there was no if. This power, which wanted to stir Roland's soul, didn't even cause a ripple on Roland. Roland was not surprised by this. He just turned his head to look at Medici, confirmed that Little Red was also unaffected, and then continued to look at the bronze door, saying, "You actually know about Adam and the true creator. I thought a shut-in dragon like you, who has been sealed, would have been offline for thousands of years." The voice within the door replied, "I have indeed been sealed here for a long time, but everyone who enters this world can provide me with information. You audience members really don't care about personal privacy." Roland shook his head, commented, and then suddenly thought of something, asking with interest. "Since you don't consider Adam and the true creator to be the sun god, then I'm very curious, what do you think you are? Are you that dragon of imagination Anquelt?" "I don't know. I am Anquelt. I am God. I am a mixture of both." The voice within the door became chaotic, as if countless people were speaking different answers at the same time. Thump, thump, thump. Roland didn't have the patience to wait for the existence within the door to recover. He knocked on the bronze door again and said with a smile, "If you want to go crazy, you can wait until no one is around." The inside of the door became quiet again. Roland then spoke again, "So you are the part of Anquelt that was contaminated by the Chaos Sea. Your will probably contains parts of both Anquelt and God." Tisk. Roland curled his lip, then continued, "I won't ask you who your self-cognition subject is. I probably know your resurrection plan. You want to resurrect in 008, return to this world in a small form, and then rely on your negative personality to control the Chaos Sea, directly becoming the King of Angel Kings. I have to say, theoretically, it's a very feasible plan. After a few seconds of silence inside the door, it said, unfortunately, there is no possibility of it being realized now. You know quite a lot. Roland smiled and continued, of course, I know that's not your only plan. The Northern King is very interesting. If I'm not mistaken, it is indeed a key, but not a key to enter the City of Miracles. You almost confused me, but it was still a little off. The ice blue scale reappeared in Roland's hand. He smiled and said, do you think I can use it to find the other consciousness you've preserved? You audience members like to cut yourselves up so much, aren't you afraid of cutting yourselves stupid? The door fell silent for a few seconds again, then said, what do you want from me? As expected of an audience, they're smarter than hunters, Roland smiled. He knew he had guessed correctly, the Northern King was indeed related to Anquelt's second resurrection contingency. Of course, Roland didn't necessarily want to destroy Anquelt's resurrection. It was mainly unnecessary. He could basically confirm that if Anquelt resurrected through the second plan, he would at most only be a Sequence 2 angel, posing no threat to Adam and them. And there were so many monsters, ghosts, and madmen in this world, it really didn't lack a Sequence 2 Anquelt. However, this didn't prevent Roland from using it to threaten Anquelt, so he said, what I want is very simple. I just want to discuss your resurrection plan with you. You don't approve of the Sun God's resurrection plan, so I'm very curious, if you resurrect in 008, would you still be considered Anquelt? As the audience bigshot before the Sun God, an ancient god who dominated the second epoch, Anquelt indeed had many unique insights into resurrection methods. Especially regarding the preservation of personality, Anquelt highly disdained the Sun God's method of resurrecting by splitting humanity and divinity into two, calling it heresy. An existence resurrected by this method, apart from memory, can no longer be considered a person at all, and is pretty much completely insane, the voice inside the door said. Although I also think so, but, Roland pinched his chin, raising a crucial question, isn't your resurrection plan also a split into two? How can that be the same? If I use a lasso hod to resurrect, although my strength will revert to Sequence 1, my personality will still be complete. As for my existence, you can understand it as being of the same nature as sorcerer. The voice inside the door retorted. He even gave an example. To give a simple example, if a complete personality is like a cookie, my existence is like a corner of the cookie stained with dust. After breaking off this corner, the cookie can still be called a cookie. But the Sun God's resurrection is like splitting this cookie in half, throwing one half into water and baking the other half with fire. After that, do you think the cookie is still a cookie? A very vivid analogy. Roland tentatively agreed with this analogy, then asked, so how did you manage to preserve the main body of the cookie completely? Roland and the voice behind the door discussed for a long time, primarily on the topics of resurrection, personality, and humanity-divinity. After exhausting the existence behind the door, Roland finally stood up contentedly and said, although I don't know who you really are, thank you for sharing. At least it gave me some inspiration. The door fell silent for a few seconds, then suddenly chuckled and said, actually, you know, don't you? Chapter 437, Things Roland Doesn't Allow. Don't say it so directly. After all, there's someone here who doesn't really want to see you, Mr. God. Since you've been playing dumb until now, why can't you play dumb to the end? Roland smiled. Of course, he knew who the person he had been discussing with for a long time was. That was the ancient god Anquelt, also the old god. Of course, this doesn't mean Anquelt is equal to God. It's just that the Anquelt personality sealed here has long been indistinguishable from God due to the pollution of the Chaos Sea, somewhat similar to Eternal Blazing Sun's previous situation. Are you talking about yourself, or are you talking about this little cat? The voice from inside the door seemed to chuckle. It clearly knew the situation outside the door and said with a sigh, I'm surprised you would choose it. I thought the witch would be your preferred choice, or the fated child. This was clearly directed at the Calamity City will. Do you think I want to choose? Is that what I want to choose? I have no choice. The Calamity City will complained in its heart but dared not speak it aloud. It merely shook the fur on its body and said, who I choose has nothing to do with you. As for you, the Calamity City will seem to think of something very interesting and said, you claim to be omniscient and omnipotent, and you can indeed always glimpse the future and plan early. Even the Celestial Venerable, who shares your origin and equal strength, in my opinion, he can't really outplay you. So, great God, have you glimpsed today, and have you glimpsed the present? The Calamity City Will's voice carried undisguised schadenfreude. From the moment it spoke, it was clear it was an old hunter. As the saying goes, if you're not doing well, it's a sunny day for me. The Calamity City Will clearly had no good feelings for God, who had once forcibly contained it. So, seeing God now looking like he had suffered at Roland's hands, it felt its own mindset balance out considerably while feeling schadenfreude. So it wasn't the only one who was unlucky. The existence inside the door was silent for a few seconds, then suddenly said with a sigh, sometimes I really don't understand. Both you and the secrecy, you clearly know that what you say will offend people, so why do you still enjoy it so much? Hey, a social butterfly like you, who can chat with everyone, naturally wouldn't understand. The Calamity City Will clearly wasn't ashamed of this at all, on the contrary, it was very proud. I really don't understand, the voice inside the door admitted frankly, then it seemed to chuckle before saying, Calamity, why did you turn into such a little cat? The Calamity City Will's movements instantly stiffened. The next second, all the fur on its body bristled. It gritted its teeth and said, none of your business. Hey, the existence inside the door chuckled again. So many years have passed, and you're still as annoying as ever. The Calamity City Will squeezed this sentence through its teeth, then turned its head away, seemingly not wanting to bother with the existence inside the door anymore. The existence inside the door didn't care. It spoke again, but not to the Calamity City Will. Roland, I greatly anticipate your ability to truly resurrect the Sun God. Roland smiled upon hearing this and said, what, you want to do a primordial resurrected in the Sun God's body 2.0? Why not? The existence inside the door said leisurely, isn't this exactly what you want, what our gamble is about? If he can suppress me, then you win. This is also your only chance to return. Roland wasn't surprised by God's choice. The closer one gets to God, the more it leads to God's revival within them. And with Roland present, God absolutely has no chance of resurrecting an eternal blazing sun or others. So the Sun God is the best choice. The Sun God, who is closest to God, is also the best vessel for God's resurrection. Besides him, even a sub-creator would be a bit lacking. Besides that, even if you lose, you've still contributed to the Sun God's resurrection. In that case, I really can't be too harsh on you. Roland spoke with a smile, saying with a sigh, as always having a backup plan a common trait of you spectators. Isn't it good? The voice inside the door retorted, this is the best choice for everyone, whether it's you or me. Hey, Roland chuckled and said, you seem much more polite to me this time than last time. Is it because you've perceived more of my essence? The voice inside the door did not deny it, only saying, Roland, everyone in this world can live, so why can't I? I just want to live, that's all. Of course, you can live, just like Anquelt's second resurrection backup, living at the sequence 2 level. No one would care about you then. But, what you need has never just been to live, but to live as God. Roland chuckled and said, I will not allow a God that is beyond my control. That's the answer. He allows the Sun God to become God because the Sun God is his friend, and because Roland has a considerable understanding of the Sun God's existence. He knows how to restrain this savior. In other words, the Sun God is actually under Roland's control. The world is the Sun God's weakness. To protect this world, the Sun God will never be the first to turn hostile. But what about God? God has no weaknesses. The only existence that can restrain it is probably the original creator. Even the Celestial Venerable is a bit lacking. But once the original creator revives, it brings destruction. So Roland will not allow God to resurrect as God. What a blunt and domineering answer. After a few seconds of silence, the voice inside the door finally said, that's why you proposed the gamble. No matter the outcome of the gamble, Roland will not allow God to resurrect. But similarly, no matter the outcome of the gamble, God will resurrect in the form of the time shadow. It's just that God, at that time, will be controlled by Roland. Yes, Roland nodded very frankly, smiling as he said, "This is also your chance, isn't it? Or does the omniscient and omnipotent God have no foresight at all regarding his original future, his original destiny?" The existence inside the door chuckled and said, "What if I foresaw it? What if I didn't? Destiny is the most unpredictable thing. Even those who claim to be omniscient and omnipotent are just struggling in vain before a predetermined destiny. Your appearance might indeed be a good thing for me." Roland smiled upon hearing this and said, "Then you should thank me. Of course, I don't value that." He then turned and said, "Thank you for providing the resurrection plan. Although I don't believe you, it does have reference value. If the sun god is resurrected because of it, I'll remember to give you a little red." The voice inside the door seemed to chuckle, or perhaps it didn't. Chapter 438 Little K chooses to plug his ears. Do you really believe him? After leaving the City of Miracles, Medici couldn't help but ask, his brows tightly furrowed. He clearly had no good feelings for beings like God, only intense vigilance. "I don't believe him. For an old schemer like him, without a contract, I wouldn't believe a single word," Roland chuckled, turning his head to look at him. "But I believe he is a smart person, and I believe in my own knowledge reserves even more." Regarding the plan to resurrect the sun god, he naturally had his own thoughts and judgment. Medici stared at him for 2 seconds, then smiled and said, "All right, as long as you know what you're doing." "Of course, I know what I'm doing," Roland chuckled. He then looked up at the distant, fake sky where a fake sun hung. Roland looked at the sun god, his gaze unfocused, clearly deep in thought. After a few seconds, he said, "I probably have some ideas, but to truly resurrect the sun god, my current abilities aren't enough. I'll probably need to advance 2 more sequences. How much of your sequence 4 potion have you digested now?" Medici was clearly still very concerned about the sun god's resurrection, and he asked. "Almost fully digested. By the time the new year arrives, the day the Chaos Church declares its existence to the world, I'll probably be able to advance to sequence 3, Roland didn't hide anything. During this period, his Joy Believer potion had indeed been continuously digested, possibly due to his involvement with church affairs and the influence of the Calamity City will in other matters. Oh, right. Roland suddenly thought of something else and turned to look at Medici, hesitating before saying, "You know, I've been collecting historical memories recently. You were a participant during the Solomon First Empire period, so I have a few key memories I'd like to collect from you. Mainly the memory of you being boiled in a hot pot. The auxiliary materials for a time observer require a memory spanning 1,000 years, containing all important nodes. For this reason, Roland, besides being busy with various matters, also took time to find participants from different historical periods to obtain their memories, such as Bethel and Antigonus. So far, most of the memories from the War of the Four Emperors period have been collected, but some crucial nodes are still missing. For example, the memory of Little Red being boiled in a hot pot. After all, such a matter was quite sensitive, so Roland hadn't sought to collect it from the person involved immediately. Medici glanced at him upon hearing this, then scoffed, "Normally, when you tell dark jokes, aren't you quite cheerful? Why are you wilting when it comes to serious business? How can that be the same thing?" Roland retorted righteously. "Dark jokes are dark jokes. Telling a few dark jokes is an indispensable condiment in life, but truly poking at someone's wound is another matter entirely. HMPH. You actually have such concerns." Medici looked at Roland with the gaze one would give a rare creature, then he smiled and said, "All right, stop being so wishy-washy like a magician. I stopped caring about such things a long time ago." While Roland's main account was busy with various serious matters, Roland's alt account was living a life of daily fishing. This fishing was actual fishing. After all, life at sea was idle, and not fishing would be a waste. I understand the logic, but why can you catch everything but fish? On the deck, little Amon looked at the fish in his bucket, then at the pile of miscellaneous things in Roland's bucket, such as squids, octopuses, and sea snails, and couldn't help but ask. "That's how we anglers are, we can catch everything but fish," Roland said, not embarrassed in the slightest but rather very pleased with himself. He then sensed something, gave a tug on his rod, and a colorful sea snake was pulled out of the water. "Oh, it's a venomous snake." Roland glanced at the sea snake, shook his head, then looked at little K next to him and called out, Gehrman. Little K, who also held a fishing rod but whose bucket was empty, looked at Roland helplessly. He then looked at the sea snake. In a moment, the sea snake's movements stiffened. After a while longer, the sea snake, which had been so arrogant just moments before, crawled into the bucket on its own. Spirit body threads are so useful. Roland gave little K a thumbs up, then looked at his empty bucket next to him and asked, so why is your bucket empty? Little K's mouth twitched, and he said without changing his expression, going home empty-handed is also an unavoidable part of fishing. That makes sense. Roland showed an expression of sudden realization. And at this moment, hurried footsteps suddenly came from behind, as if someone was chasing someone else. The next second, Mobit Soroyast's voice rang out. I'm sorry. I swear I'll never secretly replace your coffee with hot cocoa again. Mobit, if you're a man, don't run. Elf singer Shattus's voice followed closely. Then a flash of lightning flickered, and the future's regular program, Mobit Getting Beaten Up, grandly commenced. Honestly, I really suspect Mobit is a masochist, otherwise, I can't explain his persistent teasing of Shattus every day, Roland commented with interest, watching the familiar scene. Maybe that's their couple's fun. Although I've never been in a relationship, that's how it's written in books. Little Amon also looked at the electric sparking little couple fighting in front of them and said, this mode seems to be called love-hate couple. Oh, right, I remember in Clara's story, she and the poetess were in this mode. Little K, who was suddenly called out. I didn't. Wait, what does Clara and the poetess's story have to do with him? Little K coldly performed a righteous severance, and at the same time, he increasingly didn't want to see what great work Magician had published recently. It wouldn't be anything good anyway. Wait, Little K suddenly realized something and looked at Little Amon in shock, saying, you read it too. Ah, why wouldn't I? Little Amon looked at Little K in confusion, and said righteously, this is your fanfiction, Gehrman. Although I think some of the character designs are too OOC, it's okay, I'm not a fundamentalist, I can accept OOC. Little K was suddenly at a loss for words, and at this moment, Jack came over, enthusiastically saying. I also think Clara is a bit OOC, but a lively hunter girl is indeed quite interesting, and the naive and sweet magician poetess's character design is also amazing. Actually, I'm more into aristocratic dragon girls, don't you think? Little Amon raised an objection. The two fellow enthusiasts began discussing back and forth, causing Little K, after a second of silence, to expressionlessly pull out earplugs and plug his ears. Chapter 439, Little K is numb. If he can't afford to provoke him, can't he at least hide? But what are hunter girl and witch poet supposed to be? Is it what he thinks? Little K took a deep breath, feeling his worldview profoundly shaken. If Future's deck wasn't so sturdy, he would have directly dug himself a large villa. He suddenly missed the great detective and Miss Puppet's love story. At least back then, there weren't so many strange elements. Future did not sail in a straight line towards Generous City. In fact, considering the overall travel experience, to better understand the customs of the Five Seas, to learn about the various colonial islands in the Five Seas, and more importantly, to help Gehrman become famous throughout the Five Seas, Future stopped at many ports along the way. At the same time, thanks to a certain person's penchant for trouble, the trio inevitably encountered incidents every time they stopped. It was precisely because of this that by the time Future arrived near Generous City, several days had passed, and Gehrman the Crazy Adventurer had already been featured in newspapers everywhere. Wow, Gehrman, it seems someone has noticed your resemblance to the protagonist of Bounty Hunter and Pirate Queen, and they're even eating substitutes. Roland held a newspaper, reading the gossip news on it, and pulling Little K beside him to share. At this moment, Little K was clearly no longer the Little K who used to feel mortified when he heard about his fanfiction. He still maintained a cold expression, a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, and said indifferently, oh. Roland glanced at him, shook his head, put down the newspaper he had finished reading, and said with a hint of disappointment, sigh, you're not fun anymore. Hey. Little K finally couldn't help but sneer, looking at the dejected Roland, and said impatiently, can't you find some other healthy hobbies? What kind of twisted pleasure is it to enjoy making others feel socially dead? I think my hobbies are quite healthy. I just like reading novels. Gehrman, don't you also like reading novels? Roland spread his hands and retorted. Little K then said expressionlessly, liking to read novels is certainly healthy, but if you have the ability, don't commission fanfiction about me. But this is really interesting. Roland showed a very innocent expression and said, and I've already said, if you feel like you've lost out, you can also commission fanfiction about me. I don't mind. Little K couldn't help but grind his teeth upon hearing this, and said impatiently, then, may I ask who your CP is? Ah. Roland blinked, and said uncertainly, according to the closeness, it's probably a gender-bent version of you. After all, besides Lucifer, the closest person to the Jack alias is Little K. Little Amon and Medici would be ranked further back. So what's the point of commissioning that? Little K said impatiently. Poor fellow. Roland shook his head, then thought for a moment and said, actually, you could commission some fanfiction about other people. That way, my attention would be diverted, and I naturally wouldn't keep commissioning fanfiction about you. Huh. Little K looked at him confused, and tentatively asked, for example. For example, Steam Lady and Rosal. As soon as Roland mentioned this, he became interested and began to enthusiastically explain his senior transmigrator's epic romance to Little K. After listening for a while, Little K finally couldn't help but ask, does Rosal know you're making this up about him? He knows. Roland spread his hands and said, and with all due respect, everything I just told you is actually true, so you really can't blame me for shipping this pair, it's because they're too real. Little K fell silent. For a moment, he doubted the sexual orientation of his senior transmigrator. But then, remembering the Rosal's diary he had read, Little K no longer doubted. After all, Rosal's aesthetic was very clear, he liked beautiful women with good looks and good figures. Why would you think Steam Lady can't be a beautiful woman? Roland posed a profound question, saying, at her level, not to mention changing her main body's gender, is it difficult to create a female avatar? Little K was silent, because based on his understanding, this seemed genuinely feasible. And as for Rosal's integrity. Haha, how could the great emperor have such a thing as integrity? Does Bernadette know? Little K thought of a very crucial question. Probably. Roland spread his hands uncertainly and said, at least Bonava knows, but he might not understand this, as his humanity isn't rich enough for that yet. After speaking, both fell silent, then Roland and Little K clasped their hands together in unison. Hope the great emperor is okay. What are you two doing? As soon as Little Amon returned, he saw his two companions praying and couldn't help but show a puzzled expression. We're praying for Rosal, hoping he won't be kicked out by his daughter, Roland said with a chuckle. Then he can go live at his mistress's house. Little Amon said casually while distributing 2 glasses of generous city drinks to them, then continued, I've inquired, the leader of the resistance is currently in the northern suburbs. If we want to find Kavatuva's whereabouts, we might be able to start with him. I've asked Shataz the elf singer about the elf ruins. She seems to have made some progress. Little Amon relayed all the information he had gathered, and finally, while drinking his beverage, he said, that's all the information I've found. The rest is up to you two. Thank you for your hard work, Little Amon. Roland reached out and patted Little Amon's shoulder, then said, leave the matter of locating the ruins to me. The place where Kavatuva is located is very special. It is a ruin left by the Elf Queen, situated between the spirit world and reality, making it very difficult to locate without coordinates. It is precisely because of this that Kavatuva has been able to act as a local god in Generous City for so long, and even the Storm Church has never been able to deal with it, because its location truly cannot be found. However, there is one characteristic of the ruins where Kavatuva is located. It is not a single ruin, but a pair of ruins. The other elf ruin corresponding to it can be found in reality. Roland asked Little Amon to inquire about these things, naturally to use them to successfully pinpoint Kavatuva's location. Of course, Roland doesn't deny that he also had the intention of fishing with elf singer Shataz, as the elf queen is clearly closely related to Kavatuva's ruins, and perhaps Shataz, the former elf queen's maid, might be able to lure her out. Anyway, Shataz herself also very much wants to see the elf queen again, so how is this not a win-win situation? Of course, Roland had no ill will towards the elf queen. He didn't even mind helping her, as long as she could provide him with some things he wanted, such as information about the Western continent. Chapter 440, Saving the Elves. Even if the Elf Queen doesn't know much about the Western continent, it doesn't matter. It was just something I was doing on the side anyway, Roland muttered to himself. This time, his main reason for locating Kavatuva was to get a high-sequence marionette for Little K and take over the resistance forces in the 5 Seas. As for the rest, it wasn't important to Roland. With that mindset, Roland leisurely finished the generous city specialty drink that Xiao Amon brought back. Then, he, Little K, and Xiao Amon first went to the Resistance's secret stronghold, snuck in using extraordinary abilities to grab some items related to Kavatuva, and then headed to the real-world elven ruins. At this moment, elf singer Shatta stood at the entrance of the ruins, her expression complex. Her eyes were unfocused, filled with recollection, nostalgia, and sadness. Mobit Soroyost paced anxiously beside her, his expression caught between wanting to speak and holding back, clearly wanting to comfort her but unsure what to say. Good afternoon, Mobit and Shattas, long time no see. Roland greeted them warmly. Good afternoon, Jack. Mobit Soroyost sighed in relief when he saw Roland and the others. Then he looked at Roland and said, Jack, Xiao Amon told us about your plan. You seem to want to use these ruins to locate another set of ruins. More or less. Roland smiled, his gaze turning to elf singer Shattas, who remained silent. He asked, Shattas, did you get the Book of Calamity from these ruins? Elf singer Shattas's eyes instantly sharpened upon hearing this. She turned to Roland and said, you really do know. She hadn't told Xiao Amon about the Book of Calamity's existence. After all, the book clearly came from the Elf Queen, and elf singer Shattas was very loyal to the Elf Queen. Of course I know. You don't need to look at me so warily. I have no designs on it, nor do I need it. Roland didn't mind elf singer Shattas's attitude and said with a smile, I also have no ill will towards your queen. On the contrary, perhaps she needs my help more. Roland looked up, meeting the wary elf singer's gaze, and said with a smile, you already understand the situation of this era. Do you think you or the Elf Queen alone can ensure the continuation of the elven race? Elf singer Shattas fell silent. Although she yearned for the Elf Queen, she wasn't a fool. She had long since understood the world's situation and the current state of the elven race. So, even if elf singer Shattas didn't want to admit it, she had to acknowledge that the elven race had long since declined, even to the brink of extinction. This situation was something neither she nor the Elf Queen could resolve. What can you do? Elf singer Shattas didn't avert her gaze, looking directly into his emerald eyes as she asked. There's not much I can do, but at least I can ensure the elven race no longer has to worry about being hunted and can continue normally. Of course, the premise is that you can live in harmony with humans. If you secretly engage in enslaving or slaughtering humans, then don't blame me for being ruthless. Roland said with a smile. Although he was fundamentally on the human side, this didn't mean Roland had any prejudice against non-humans. After all, the concept of extraordinary races enslaving humans was ancient history, thousands of years ago. Later, with the fall of the various ancient gods and the decline of the extraordinary races, the old grudges had basically been settled. The new generation of extraordinary races and humans generally had no animosity, and if they did, it was because of human suppression. Just as he could accept the existence of vampires, as long as they abided by the law and didn't cause trouble, Roland didn't mind helping the elven race. Moreover, the original elves were, after all, transformed from Easterners. For Roland, they were a sort of substitute, and he felt a certain kinship. At the same time, this was also a form of checks and balances. Roland was well aware that although the Lord of Storms had not yet bowed to the Sun God, it was only a matter of time. And once the Lord of Storms also knelt, 3 of the current 7 great churches would belong to the staunch Sun God faction. Among the remaining 4 churches, the Steam Church could be considered part of Roland's camp due to Rosal. Lilith had boarded Roland's pirate ship due to the Mother Goddess, and the God of War Church would eventually be swallowed by the Evernight Goddess. And while the Evernight Goddess was allied with Roland, she couldn't be considered part of Roland's camp, as the Evernight Goddess had a very good relationship with the Sun God, essentially standing with both sides. It could be said that, in terms of influence, Roland was currently evenly matched with the Sun God. In this situation, Roland naturally had to consider how to deal with the sun god's subordinates if he ever fell out with the sun god in the future. This was called being prepared. There was nothing more to say about eternal blazing sun. Having accepted Roland's treatment, he wouldn't be able to make a splash if Roland didn't want him to. Hariburgen was a smart dragon, and because he was smart, he was, to some extent, easier to deal with. However, the Lord of Storms, as the old pigeon among old pigeons, a sequence 0 known for his fiery temper, was the one who gave Roland the biggest headache. But it didn't matter. As the saying goes, fight fire with fire. The hot-headed elven race and the Lord of Storms would surely have a lot in common. As for whether the elven race would break free from Roland's control in the future, Roland wasn't worried. If he couldn't even control a declining elven race, he might as well go home and continue his battle of wits with Nyarlathotep. You worry too much. Although elves are hot-tempered, we are not bloodthirsty. As for enslavement, I don't deny that such things existed in the past, but the era has long since changed, and such things will not happen again. Elf singer Shattaz shook her head, her smile somewhat self-mocking and bitter. In the second epic, the elven race did indeed enslave humans, or rather, humans in that era basically survived by relying on various extraordinary races. Among them, the elven race was already considered one of the better extraordinary races towards humans. At the very least, the elven race never ate humans and would even shelter the humans under their rule, protecting them from attacks by various monsters. This was actually a commonality among several humanoid extraordinary races at the time. Compared to humans living in the territories of demonic wolves or giant dragons, humans who relied on elves and giants for survival, although their lives were difficult, their overall survival was generally guaranteed to a certain extent. The reason for this was simple. Both the Elf King and the Giant King were once humans. They were ancient gods transformed from humans, and although they were already half mad, they still had some affection for humanity, though this affection had become very faint. Perhaps for this reason, after the sun god defeated all the ancient gods and led humanity to rise, extraordinary races like elves, giants, and vampires, although severely wounded, did not face near extinction like the giant dragons and demonic wolves. Instead, many of them integrated into human society. Therefore, a significant portion of today's humans actually have mixed blood from these three races. For example, Hanged Man Alger of the Tarot Club has a certain amount of elven blood. Chapter 441, Hunting Kavatuva. As for the current state of the elf race, almost on the verge of extinction, that can only be described as a later development, caused by the elf race lacking the protection of a powerful figure and their Beander characteristics being too tempting. For example, the blood race, with Lilith secretly protecting them, lives quite well. As for the giants doing poorly, one can only say that the god of combat is not a good person. But why do you want to help us? Elf singer Shattaz asked again, her expression serious and her gaze sharp. What do you want to gain from us? Can't it just be that I simply want to do a good deed? Roland smiled, his smile innocent and cheerful. Just like when I rescued you from the book world, I didn't scheme against you for anything. Elf singer Shattaz fell silent for a few seconds upon hearing this, then said, I believe you are a good person, but I don't believe in the power behind you. I don't believe a power would help the elf race for no reason. Huh, she actually believed it. Roland blinked, then smiled and said, all right, if you absolutely need an answer, then it's probably that I, or rather the power behind me, needs you to counterbalance the Storm Church. This was the plain truth. For one thing, with the elf race as a medium, Roland might be able to summon the Elf King. This was a special attack for Old Pigeon. Elf singer Shattaz was clearly stunned when she heard this, then she frowned and said, are you lying to me? The former elf race might have been able to do this, but the current elf race. At this point, elf singer Shattaz paused, ultimately not saying that the current elf race was so miserable that if a sequence 3 high-ranking Beander from the Storm Church appeared, they might be completely wiped out. This was a bit too cruel for elf singer Shattaz, who had once lived during the glorious period of the elf race. I'm not lying. Of course, you can't do this now, but the future is uncertain, Roland said with a smile, his words unhurried. And I don't actually expect you to truly fight the Storm Church. You are just a backup that can be supported if one day in the future, my teacher falls out with the Storm Church. The Storm Pathway is very useful, whether in daily life or in combat, so we need a backup to ensure that even if we fall out with the Storm Church in the future, we won't lack beyonders in this area, Roland added. Elf singer Shadis's expression became a little unsightly upon hearing this. She naturally understood Roland's meaning. The other party was clearly currently in a cooperative state with the Storm Church, and choosing to support them, the elves, was as a counterbalance and backup in case they turned against each other in the future. Quote, "What if I refuse?" Elf singer Shadis took a deep breath, suppressing her irritable mood, and asked, "What will you do?" "I won't do anything," Roland answered very directly. "I won't slaughter the elf race, but I also won't stop the Storm Church from any actions against you." In short, it was to let the elf race fend for themselves. And given the current situation of the elf race, without Roland's intervention, after a few years, they might face extinction. Elf singer Shadis pursed her lips, her eyes struggling, as if she was conflicted about something. After a moment, she looked at Roland and said, "I cannot make decisions on such matters. The king has fallen, and now only the elf queen can decide the fate of the elf race." Hearing this, Roland smiled. He knew that his plan to use elf singer Shadis to bait the elf queen had probably succeeded, as the former had clearly contacted the latter. Roland was not surprised by this. He smiled and said, "I don't mind talking to your elf queen. If you don't trust me, I don't need your elf queen to come in person. An incarnation or a descent of will is fine. Can you make decisions on such matters?" Elf singer Shadis looked at Roland and asked. "I can. My status is probably higher than you think. As long as I approve of something, my teacher will not object," Roland said with a smile. Elf singer Shadis looked deeply at Roland upon hearing this, her expression not too surprised, as she had not been idle during this time and had inquired about information regarding Jack. Elf singer Shadis simply said, "I will report this matter to the elf queen. I look forward to talking with her," Roland said with a smile. Then he thought of something else and said, "Before that, why don't we go to another elf ruin and hunt Kavatuva? Gehrman still needs a new marionette." Elf singer Shadis glanced at Roland, her lips moved a few times, but she ultimately did not utter the words, "That is the elf queen's property." Elf singer Shadis was not an unreasonable person. Just as in the original work, she would exchange the elf singer potion formula with Klein for the wine glass the elf queen once used, rather than rudely demanding it from Klein with the excuse, "That used to be the elf queen's property." Elf singer Shadis knew very well that thousands of years had passed, and these things had long found new owners. She would collect them as much as possible, but she would no longer treat them as rightfully hers. And since the elf queen abandoned that part of the characteristics, there must be her deep meaning. Elf singer Shadis thought this, but her heart still felt a little sad. Thousands of years had passed, and this world, after all, had changed, making her feel both uncomfortable and unfamiliar. No matter what elf singer Shadis thought, even though she didn't directly jump out to object, Roland happily located the ruin where Kavatuva was, then led everyone inside the ruin. The inside of the ruin was not quiet at this moment. Elf singer Shadis taking the Book of Disaster had clearly affected Kavatuva, making the sea snake's state increasingly unstable, even on the verge of collapse. When Roland and the others arrived at the ruin, Kavatuva was unleashing its madness. Lightning was everywhere inside the entire ruin, and the dried corpses of sea god cult believers were visible everywhere. "Wait, brother, is it really okay for us to just go trouble Kavatuva like this?" After walking past a drifting lightning bolt, Mobid Soroyost finally realized a very serious problem and couldn't help but ask, "It's a sequence 3, isn't it?" The information about Kavatuva was not a secret. Anyone who understood the Beander pathways well, had heard its honorific name, and knew something about the sea god cult, would not find it difficult to deduce this point. "What are you afraid of? Don't you have an old man with you?" Roland looked at Mobid Soroyost and said with a smile. Pales's incarnation was still with Mobid Soroyost. But the old man's incarnation here is only sequence 4. Mobid Soroyost was clearly a little distraught. He said in disbelief, "Brother, you're not expecting the old man to deal with Kavatuva, are you?" Roland blinked, and deliberately said, "If I said yes." Chapter 442, Demigod Marionette Acquired. "Then I think we still need to plan this out carefully." Mobid Soroyost didn't say, "Let's run away," but instead stated with a stern face. PFF'd. Roland finally couldn't help but chuckle, then he shook his head and said, "Don't worry, I didn't expect Pales to do anything. Since I dared to come here, I naturally have my trump card." Roland didn't keep them in suspense. He immediately started pulling things out of his pocket, introducing them as he did. This is a high-level charm of the Hunter pathway, which can unleash an attack equivalent to a Conqueror's strike. This is a high-level charm of the Door pathway, which can seal others' Beander abilities. This is a high-level charm of the Spectator pathway, even an angel-level existence would be dazed for a few seconds if hit by it. This is a high-level charm of the Earth pathway, as long as they're not dead, they can be healed back. After this pile of items was introduced, Mobit Soroyost was utterly dumbfounded, and Elf Singer Shattaz also widened her eyes in surprise. Xiao Amon, on the other hand, pouted and said, "So unfair, so unfair. I don't even have this many charms." Little K was not surprised by this, after all, he helped organize these charms. After introducing the charms, Roland then pulled out something that looked like a wooden doll and introduced it. This is the Curse Doll, personally crafted by the god of steam and machinery using the Sequence 3 Silent Disciple characteristic of the Aberrant pathway. It's considered a Grade 1 sealed artifact. No, wait, brother, you carry a Grade 1 sealed artifact with you. Mobit Soroyost looked at the seemingly unremarkable wooden doll in Roland's hand, feeling his worldview being refreshed. Then he thought of something and said, "If I'm not mistaken, the negative effects of this level of sealed artifact are all terrifying, right? You don't need to worry about that. The cursed doll indeed has strong negative characteristics, but it possesses living characteristics, so when I use it, it can be said to have no negative effects." Roland said with a smile. It is well known that sealed artifacts with living characteristics have negligible negative effects. After all, such sealed artifacts can be reasoned with. Mobit Soroyost fell silent. As a Marauder pathway Beander, he naturally knew how High Sequence Go 3 family members dealt with living sealed artifacts. While he felt relieved, his gaze towards the cursed doll carried a faint pity. Undoubtedly, for the Grade 1 sealed artifact, the cursed doll, to appear so obedient, it must have endured many beatings. Next to him, Little K subconsciously touched the creeping hunger on his hand, feeling a little guilty for some reason. "Since you have so many good things, brother, then I have no problem. Let's go hunt that sea serpent." After a brief shock, Mobit Soroyost immediately spoke with a hint of excitement. A Sequence 5 overturning a Sequence 3, he could brag about this for 10 years. For Kavatuva, today was a very unlucky day. Originally, it was staying in the ruins as usual, enjoying the offerings from its believers, while contemplating whether to kill 2 believers to celebrate. However, under such circumstances, Kavatuva suddenly sensed that something important had been taken away by someone, and its state consequently became unstable. At this moment, Kavatuva suddenly realized that the ruins it was in were not isolated. There was another ruin in a different place, and in that ruin existed something closely related to it. This item had now clearly been taken away. Upon discovering this, Kavatuva was furious. It immediately contacted its believers outside to search for the lost item, and at the same time, being already half mad, it did not intend to suppress its anger, but directly vented it. After all, to it, all believers were just unimportant leaks. Even if they were gone, it could always find new ones. However, as Kavatuva was venting its anger, it suddenly sensed something amiss. A power suddenly invaded its body, attempting to transform it into something else. Kavatuva naturally would not let this happen. Silver lightning instantly illuminated its entire body, resisting the curse from the Silent Disciple. As a fellow Sequence 3 existence, even in a poor state, Kavatuva would not be transformed into a sheep without any resistance. But the arrival of the curse was clearly just the beginning. Following it, red flames descended from the sky, transforming into countless fiery spears that assailed Kavatuva. This was a power exceeding the Sequence 3 level. Kavatuva's huge serpent eyes constricted at this moment, and its massive body was engulfed in a sea of fire the next second. For Roland, dealing with Kavatuva was naturally not a problem. Although he was currently just an ordinary Sequence 6, with his divine equipment, fighting a half-crippled Sequence 3 was still no issue. The only thing Roland needed to be careful about was not to be too heavy-handed, and not to accidentally kill Kavatuva directly. After all, a dead Kavatuva could not be used as a marionette. Fortunately, Kavatuva was quite tough, and coupled with Roland's restraint, after several rounds of attacks, the dying sea serpent, though nearly on its last legs, had not truly perished. Then, the final step, Roland flipped his hand, and several spectator pathway charms appeared in it. Given Kavatuva's spirit body strength, in order for little K to successfully turn it into a marionette, weakening its spirit body strength was essential. And the abilities of the spectator pathway were clearly perfectly suited for this aspect. Mind deprivation, mental storm, spirit pierce. After several spectator pathway charms were used, Roland checked Kavatuva's condition again. After confirming that it was indeed in an extremely weakened state, he looked at little K and said, "It's your turn, Gehrman." Little K nodded. He took a deep breath. Although he was slightly nervous, he had no thought of retreating. He walked to Kavatuva's side and immediately began to manipulate Kavatuva's spirit body threads. This was not a simple task. The gap between Sequence 5 and Sequence 3 was too great. Even though Kavatuva had been weakened to its last breath, its essence was still that of a demigod, which made its spirit body extremely violent and difficult to control. Little K, however, silently struggled to suppress Kavatuva's spirit body with his spirit body threads. Cold sweat gradually appeared on his forehead, but his expression grew calmer. After some time, little K suddenly raised his hand, and his fingers moved a few times as if manipulating a puppet. The next second, Kavatuva's massive body began to move, clearly following little K's control. Succeeded? Roland immediately asked. He was still very concerned about little K's matters. Amon next to him also cast a concerned look. Yes, I didn't fail. Little K couldn't help but show a smile at this moment. He then seemed to ponder for a few seconds, his fingers moving again, and Kavatuva's massive size began to shrink, eventually reducing to the size of a human. This made little K frown, but there was nothing he could do about it. With his current faceless ability, he couldn't further change Kavatuva's size. Fortunately, compared to the colossal size it was initially, Kavatuva's current size was relatively less astonishing, at least it was somewhat convenient to carry. Chapter 443 He just wants to see him. That's great. Roland immediately clapped, showing encouragement. In that case, can we go hunt the Undying King now? Little K suggested with interest. I heard he's not a good guy, but his ship is very nice. Good idea. Roland's eyes lit up upon hearing this, and he nodded repeatedly. Perhaps we can try. Little K considered for a second before not directly rejecting it. Among the pirate kings, the Undying King was relatively weak. With their current strength, they could indeed confront him. But I heard the Undying King is very cunning and a bit hard to catch. Roland raised a crucial question. That is indeed a problem. Little K nodded. The few of them naturally began discussing hunting the Undying King until a female voice joined their conversation. If the Undying King you speak of is active at sea, perhaps elf singer Shattaz can help. This voice belonged to elf singer Shattaz, but the speaker was clearly not elf singer Shattaz. Roland looked at the other party without surprise, seeing elf singer Shattaz looking at them expressionlessly, while Mobit Soroyast beside her was incredibly nervous. Nice to meet you, Your Majesty the Elf Queen. Roland smiled at the other party. He knew that the Elf Queen's will was descending upon elf singer Shattaz. Nice to meet you, Your Excellency. The Elf Queen's tone was polite, but her expression remained unchanged. She looked at Roland and said, I already know Your Excellency's intention. If the power behind you can indeed shelter and ensure the continuation of the elven race, I don't mind the elven race becoming the blade Your Excellency uses to balance the Storm Church. The Elf Queen sighed at this point before continuing, after all, even without Your Excellency, the Storm Church would not let go of the elves, and now, I am unable to shelter my people. The Elf Queen then looked at Roland and said, but what Your Excellency wants should be more than just this. Hey, Roland couldn't help but chuckle. He could tell that while the Elf Queen seemed to agree readily, there were actually many nuanced points in her words. She hadn't truly committed, but rather adopted an ambiguous attitude that seemed like an agreement. Roland was not surprised by this. He simply said, what I want is indeed more than this, but it's not much. He looked up at the Elf Queen and said directly, I want to know some things about the Western continent. I wonder if Your Majesty can tell me. The Elf Queen finally showed a hint of change at this moment. She looked deeply at Roland before saying, "That is the true homeland of the elves, but I actually don't know much about it. The king might know more, but the king has already fallen." "It's all right, just tell me what you know," Roland said with a smile. After a pause, he slowly added, "As for what the elf king knows, I can ask him personally." The elf queen's pupils clearly trembled. She said, "I don't understand what you mean. Don't worry, I don't know where the elf king's resurrection contingency is. It might exist, or it might not, that's not important." Roland said unhurriedly, "I can just let you see the elf king of the past, the king from thousands of years ago." Of course, not now. Roland wouldn't summon any elf king now. After all, the other party was in existence no less than Sequence 0. Summoning the other party at this time would be purely asking for trouble. As for his words, he was just bluffing the elf queen, or rather, it couldn't be considered a bluff, since he wasn't summoning now, but he could still summon later. "I don't understand what your excellency means by that." The elf queen was stunned for a moment, then showed clear confusion. "It's hard for me to explain. How about this, do you know anyone important who died a long time ago?" Roland asked with a smile. Incredible power, I have never seen power like yours." The elf queen's expression was a mix of shock and trance. Just now, she had witnessed the marvel of time shadow. "This is not my power, it is my teacher's power," Roland retorted, maintaining the persona of Jack, and said, "I don't know if you want to see the elf king again, but I think after witnessing this power, you should know what it means." The elf queen snapped out of her trance upon hearing this. She, of course, knew what this power meant. She also knew that the other party was both enticing and deterring her. If she had any deceased person she wished to see, she would long to borrow this power again. If she had no one she wished to see, realizing what this power meant, she would also understand the other party's strength. And she, the elf queen, closed her eyes, and upon reopening them, she looked at Roland and said, "The elven race can serve you, and I can tell you everything I know. What do you want?" Roland was not surprised to hear such an answer and asked with a smile. I want to see the king again." When the elf queen said this, countless old memories flooded her mind, all the little moments she had shared with the elf king. Did the elf king have a resurrection contingency? Of course, he did. Most ancient gods, more or less, had resurrection contingencies. High-sequence existences in this world simply refused to stay dead. But having a resurrection contingency doesn't mean one can truly resurrect. For details, see a certain old Grim Reaper. Even if he resurrects, it doesn't mean he's the same person. For details, see a certain famous sun god. So you two really loved each other? Roland didn't answer whether it was possible, but after staring at the elf queen for a few seconds, he suddenly asked with interest. Examples of high-sequence unions were not uncommon, but not many of them involved genuine affection. The Night Emperor and the Blood Moon Queen were one pair, and Tudor and the Witch, that crazy couple, were another. Besides them, not many other high-sequence couples had true feelings. Most were united by interest, or simply desired each other's characteristics, or wanted to have a child to expel excess characteristics. So Roland was genuinely curious, did true affection exist between the Elf King and the Elf Queen? "I am his wife, I am his queen. I don't know what love is, I just want to see him," the Elf Queen replied, her expression not coy, but rather very frank. Roland stared at her for a few seconds, then smiled and said, "That's probably love." He then turned and said, "I can help you see him, but not now. I will not allow an uncontrolled ancient god to appear in this world." The Elf Queen was silent for a few seconds, clearly somewhat disappointed. She then said, "How long do I need to wait?" "Not long, until my teacher advances to Sequence 0 or the Lord of the Mysteries is born," Roland said just as frankly. The Elf Queen was silent for a few more seconds, then she actually smiled and said, "That indeed won't be very long." She, of course, didn't know how far the current battle for the Lord of the Mysteries had progressed, but she knew very well that before the apocalypse, a new Lord of the Mysteries would inevitably be born. Or, the former Lord of the Mysteries would revive. And now, only a little over a decade remained until the apocalypse. Compared to thousands of years of separation, a decade or so was indeed not very long. Chapter 444, Hello, Celestial Master. After reaching an agreement with the Elf Queen, Roland obtained the information he desired from her, the coordinates of the few remaining elf settlements and intelligence on the western continent. The elf queen didn't know much about the western continent, but she brought Roland a pleasant surprise. You can contact people from the western continent. Roland looked at the elf queen in surprise, a bit astonished that she still had such a trump card. This was not mentioned in the original work. The western continent was not entirely cut off from the outside world, perhaps it was thousands of years ago, but now, with the passage of time and the weakening of the seal, its isolation from the outside world was no longer absolute. Otherwise, Banseaport would not have a branch of the City of Calamity. In fact, the god of steam and machinery was influenced by the celestial master from the western continent, also known as the Knowledge Wilderness. That's something the king left behind. It looks like a book made of bamboo, and the king called it a bamboo slip. Quote. The elf queen briefly introduced, I don't know its exact situation, but I guess it's at least a pair, and the other part might be in the western continent. When I said it could contact the interior of the western continent, it wasn't entirely accurate, because most of the time it's only a one-way connection. In the beginning, due to language barriers, it was often an ineffective connection. The elf queen then described how to use the bamboo slip: simply carve words onto it, and sometimes a reply would appear on the slip. These replies were not timely, were unstable, and often incomplete, with only a few words appearing for an entire sentence. I'm not sure what the situation is like on the western continent, but I guess the other half of the bamboo slip must have passed through many hands and was lost for a long time afterward. After the fourth epoch, for several hundred years, I didn't see any replies on the bamboo slip until people suddenly started replying again in the last 200 years, the elf queen said, seemingly with no intention of hiding anything. Roland raised his eyebrows and asked with interest, then who is the person who has been replying on the bamboo slip recently? I don't know that person's true identity, only that he calls himself the Celestial Master, the elf queen replied without concealment. He is a very knowledgeable existence, seemingly the leader of a certain sect, and very interested in outside matters. At this point, the elf queen seemed to recall something and added, he seems especially interested in Rosal. Roland. Celestial Master. Which Celestial Master? The Tao Integrator from the Knowledge Wilderness. Roland's expression became very subtle for a moment. The elf queen looked at him and naturally noticed something, then tentatively asked, you know him? I know him, Roland replied candidly. He smiled and looked at the elf queen, saying, if it's the Celestial Master I know, he's an extraordinary figure. The Tao Integrator of the Knowledge Wilderness, to some extent, was half an old one. I had some suspicions about this. The elf queen was not surprised by this result. As the former elf queen, she was not lacking in knowledge and had naturally discerned something from the Celestial Master's words. So where is that bamboo slip now? Roland asked directly. He was still very curious about the Celestial Master. At the location of my true body. I will send it over later, the elf queen replied. That's straightforward. Roland glanced at her. It's no longer useful to me, the elf queen replied just as straightforwardly, it's better to give it to you to realize its final value. Roland smiled upon hearing this and didn't continue the topic, instead discussing the elf race with the elf queen. There are not many elves currently existing. While mixed bloods might not be few, the number of true pure-blooded elves is pitifully small. And with the elf queen's help, managing these elves would naturally not be difficult. Or rather, Roland didn't need to personally manage them, he only needed to control the elf queen and then select a few from the existing elf race to cultivate, which would help these elves be useful to him when needed. Of course, Roland was not one to make empty promises. Since he had agreed to shelter the elf race, he would naturally bring them under his wing. On one hand, he informed the Storm Church of the fact that, the elf race is now on our side, and on the other hand, he brought the god of the bound Toltsana over to help look after the existing elf race. While Roland was handling the elf race's affairs, Little K naturally began to use Kavatuva's alias to cleanse and reorganize the sea god cult, gather the rebels on the 5 seas, and arrange their subsequent actions, preparing for the upcoming comprehensive reforms. Because both troublemakers began to focus on serious matters, the number of victimized pirates on the 5 seas temporarily decreased significantly, making many pirates weep with joy. During this period, the Elf Queen naturally delivered the bamboo slip into Roland's hands one day. It really looks like an ancient bamboo slip. Roland touched the bamboo slip, which had a rather pre-Qin dynasty feel, and couldn't help but smile. He then opened the bamboo slip and saw a vertical line of dialogue, clearly meant to be read from right to left. Celestial Master, this is my last conversation with you. Afterwards, I will hand the bamboo slip to another person. This was clearly the Elf Queen, and what she wrote was surprisingly in Chinese, though the handwriting was not very good. Below it was a reply, and the person who replied clearly had excellent handwriting. Roland even saw traces of a familiar font. No matter, fellow Taoist, do you need help? Could you inform me of the successor's identity? And then came the Elf Queen's answer. I am fine and do not need help. The successor's name is Jack Jones, a student of a very special existence. Forgive me, I cannot tell you how special the other party is, perhaps you will know after you speak with him. I understand, thank you for informing me, fellow Taoist. This was the Celestial Master's reply. The content on the bamboo slip stopped abruptly here, and the remaining space was blank. Roland knew that it wasn't that they had only chatted these few sentences for thousands of years, but rather that the bamboo slip would clear the previous content after each conversation. After thinking for a moment, Roland picked up a carving knife and wrote on the bamboo slip. Hello, Celestial Master. I am Jack, a survivor of the Old One era. My teacher is preparing to resist the apocalypse and will soon help the new Lord of the Mysteries replace the former celestial worthy, allowing the Sun God to return to this world. V-me 50 to hear my detailed plan. Done. Hope to get a reply soon. Roland put down the carving knife and clapped his hands, only to see little K looking at him with a subtle expression. Why are you looking at me like that? Roland showed a puzzled expression, clearly completely unaware of what he had just done. Chapter 445, Western Continent Heavenly Master and Luo Lin. Do you really have to be so playful? Little K asked tactfully. He naturally knew the V-me 50 feet meme and what the Lord of Mysteries were. After all, the existence of the Lord of the Mysteries was not as dangerous as the outer gods. Although Roland hadn't specifically informed Little K, he hadn't really hidden it either. After hearing it many times, Little K naturally knew that the Lord of the Mysteries was equivalent to the Celestial Venerable. Of course, because being playful makes me happy. Roland nodded as a matter of course, grinning, and even though I'm just playing on a meme, anyone with a discerning eye can see the value in these words. Neither the Lord of Mysteries, the Celestial Venerable, nor the Sun God are things unknown to nobodies. As long as you're happy. Little K shook his head, unable to say anything else, only silently praying in his heart that the Celestial Master on the other side wouldn't take Jack for a swindler. Theoretically, that shouldn't happen, given the Elf Queen's prior introduction. At the same time, Little K also admitted that he was equally curious about the Western continent, as that was his true homeland in a meaningful sense. Even if his homeland had surely changed beyond recognition by now, it was still his homeland after all. Unfortunately, either there was no one on the other side, or the connection was bad, as there was no immediate reply. Roland didn't mind this. After putting away the bamboo slip, he continued with his main tasks. It wasn't until that evening, when Roland was grilling on the deck of the future with Little K, Xiao Amon, and Anderson, that he finally received a reply from the other side. Hello, fellow Taoist Jack. I wonder what this, V-me 50 feet means. Could you please enlighten me? If I am able to do it, I will certainly try. Roland raised an eyebrow at the reply, then sighed, saying, what a pity, it seems the Celestial Master doesn't surf the net. Little K, next to Roland, naturally also saw the reply, and his expression became a little subtle for a moment. He couldn't help but say, Jack, why don't you write something more serious? What do you mean, not serious? This is clearly very serious. Roland retorted in dissatisfaction. Then he took out his carving knife, and after thinking for a few seconds, wrote on the bamboo slip. Senior, please don't mind it, I was just making a joke. The other side might have been silent, or the network might have been stuck. After about 10 minutes, a reply came. Fellow Taoist is quite humorous. Is that a compliment or sarcasm? Roland chuckled, not minding it, and continued to write with his carving knife. Senior overpraises me. My teacher is named Lucifer, also a survivor from the olden era. He helped Mr. Door solve his corruption problem. Perhaps you know who Mr. Door is. This time, the other side replied without delay, almost immediately. I know Mr. Dorr. He is a commendable existence. Is he well? That is truly reassuring. Roland continued to write. My teacher possesses some special powers, and thus has successfully enabled the sun god to briefly resurrect in this era, though true revival has not yet been achieved. However, before the true arrival of the apocalypse, I believe the sun god will certainly return to this world. The other side replied. Fellow Taoist's teacher is truly admirable to us. If a new celestial venerable can be born and the sun god resurrected, then the crisis of the apocalypse will also have a solution. In that case, fellow Taoist's teacher would be a great meritorious individual who saved all living beings. Roland looked at these words, which could be considered praise, and smiled. He naturally knew that the person on the other side might not have believed him. After all, seeing is believing, and hearing is not. But the other side clearly didn't mind humoring him, so he continued to write. In addition, my teacher also suppressed a portion of the City of Calamity, separating it from the main body. I wonder what the situation is with that part of the City of Calamity on the Western continent now. The other side fell silent again for a while before replying. Did fellow Taoist's teacher suppress the incarnation of the Calamity Dragon 10 days ago? So after I severed the Lesser Calamity, the main body of the City of Calamity over there wasn't completely still. Roland raised an eyebrow, not surprised by this, and replied. Yes. The other side was probably digesting this information. After a while, they said. Fellow Taoist's teacher truly possesses great power. Severing a Beander characteristic is not something an ordinary person can do. The last one to do so was the original creator. Hey. Roland couldn't help but chuckle, then slowly wrote. So, Senior, do you believe what I just said? The other side probably didn't expect Roland to directly break through this barrier. After a few minutes, they replied. Fellow Taoist, please don't take offense. It's just that this matter is of great importance, and what fellow Taoist said is too incredible. Without evidence, we cannot simply believe fellow Taoist's words. It's all right, I understand. Roland continued to write on the bamboo slip, then paused and added, I've finished explaining my situation. Senior, would you mind introducing your situation? This time, the other party replied without delay. What does fellow Taoist wish to know? If it doesn't involve secrets, I will certainly tell you everything I know. That's quite a frank answer. Roland pinched his chin. If he had to say what he was most interested in about the Western continent, it wasn't really secrets but rather its history. After all, the various figures and their tumultuous experiences in the outside world over the past few millennia have been truly fascinating. Roland was very curious about what kind of stories the Western continent, which held a large portion of the Beander characteristics, would have over these past few millennia. So Roland said very directly, I'm not interested in secrets. I'm more interested in your history. Or rather, I'm most interested in all sorts of people. I love exciting stories, especially those that actually happened. I know this might involve some hidden truths, and you don't need to tell me those. I just want to know some of the most widely circulated historical stories and legends from your side. Roland indicated that he knew his limits. Any historical secrets could be investigated later. For now, understanding the general framework was enough. The other side fell silent again, perhaps weighing their words or organizing their thoughts. After a long while, they replied. I can tell fellow Taoist a few stories. They may not be entirely true and might contain fictional elements, but they are indeed the most widely circulated stories. Roland and the Celestial Master had a pleasant chat. Although neither of them fully trusted the other, nor were they sure how much truth or falsehood was in the other's words, it had to be said that at least the Celestial Master's stories were quite enjoyable. And so, as Roland occasionally chatted with the Celestial Master while continuing his sea adventures with Amon and Little K, time passed day by day. Soon, the new year was finally approaching. This was the end of the old year and the beginning of the new, and it was also the day Roland and the others had set to officially launch the reform. So, as this day drew near, Little K and the others interrupted their sea journey and returned to Backland. They would participate in the upcoming reform. Chapter 446, Audrey and Two Choices. Medici and Saussure, with a tacit understanding, made their final preparations for the upcoming revolution. In the days that followed, Medici would naturally be responsible for the war front, while Saussure would handle logistics and a series of other tasks. According to the plan, the revolutionary initiative had two main parts. The first part was naturally the official uprising led by Medici's rebel army, fighting for revolution, for equality, and for justice, completely reforming the Luan kingdom from the bottom to the top. The other part would be handled by Roland. He would bring his people to give the Augustus royal family a small surprise, preventing Augustus's inhuman plan, and incidentally carrying out a decapitation strike. Ultimately, Roland not directly taking down Augustus and then implementing reforms from top to bottom wasn't because he couldn't, but because such a method might lead to an incomplete reform. However, this didn't mean Roland couldn't execute a decapitation strike, taking down Backland at the very beginning of the revolution, leaving Loan directly without a leader. This would not affect the outcome of the revolution, as a decapitation strike was still different from a top-down reform. On the eve of this day, Roland, having returned to Backland, didn't rush to meet Medici to discuss the official launch tomorrow. Instead, he first went to see an old friend. The person Roland met was none other than the friend he had made shortly after arriving in the Lord of the Mysteries world, Miss Justice of the Tarot Club, Ms. Audrey Hall. Roland met her as Mr. Lucifer. Mr. Lucifer, do you need something from me? Audrey asked, looking at the unfamiliar yet familiar angel before her with surprise. Unfamiliar because Audrey had not formally met Mr. Lucifer before, and familiar because he was not a stranger to the members of the Tarot Club. Audrey, I am very curious, between justice and class, which will you choose? Roland gazed at the golden-haired girl before him and spoke with a smile. What? Audrey clearly didn't quite understand the meaning of these words. Walk with me. There are some things I think you need to see for yourself. Only then can you make a choice that truly aligns with your heart. Roland smiled, not explaining anything, and said cryptically, because you are Jack's friend, a member of the Tarot Club, I am willing to give you an opportunity. Audrey's expression remained puzzled, but though she was naive, she was not foolish. Even if she didn't quite understand what was happening, she had already realized that Mr. Lucifer might be saying something important. So, after a moment of hesitation, Audrey nodded and said, All right, Mr. Lucifer, it is my honor to accompany you for a walk. However, please give me a few minutes, I need to ensure my maid won't be confused by my disappearance. No need. Roland smiled and snapped his fingers. A figure that looked exactly like Audrey appeared beside her. Of course, it wasn't a real person, but a very realistic illusion. She will stay here in your place. Unless it's a demigod, no one will be able to see through it, Roland said. Audrey couldn't help but look at her illusion with curious eyes, and finally, she no longer hesitated, nodding and saying, All right, then I have no problem. The two then left Audrey's home. Since Roland could use the abilities of the door pathway, going anywhere was naturally not a problem for them, so they quickly arrived in the East District. Then, starting from the East District, Roland took Audrey to many places, such as various slums and the factories of various big merchants, leading her to see countless people of all kinds, yet all with gaunt faces, as if they could collapse at any moment. Audrey, whose expression was initially quite lighthearted at the beginning of the journey, became increasingly silent as she saw more and more people. Finally, Roland took Audrey back to her room, looked at the complex and sorrowful Audrey, and said, Do you think they deserve to die? Of course they don't deserve to die, this isn't right. Why? I don't know, Audrey bit her lower lip. After joining the Tarot Club, she was no longer as naive as before and had become aware of some dark existences. But before today, Audrey had only known about those dark and cruel things from newspapers, from her father's intelligence, or from others' discussions. She had never truly come into contact with this side of the world. Therefore, today's journey was a huge shock to Audrey. This girl, who was in some ways naive and even out of touch with reality due to her background, realized for the first time how cruel the world truly was. Do you want to change all of this? Roland was not surprised by Audrey's reaction. He simply gazed calmly at the noble girl before him and asked, Can I change all of this? Audrey looked up at Roland, her tone urgent, her eyes bewildered. Of course she wanted to change all of this, but she didn't know how. Of course you can, at least you can participate in this change, becoming a part of changing it. Roland smiled, but his words were not gentle, even appearing cruel, but this requires you to pay a huge price. It requires you to abandon everything you currently possess, and even betray the nobility to which you belong. Audrey was stunned. At this moment, she had clearly not considered such a thing, and she remained frozen in place. Of course, no matter what you choose, change is already inevitable, it will not change because of your choice. Of course, you can help it proceed more smoothly, or you can create some small obstacles for it. All of this depends on your choice. Roland spoke unhurriedly. He was not worried that Audrey would leak secrets, as leaking secrets was meaningless in the face of absolute strength. What if Augustus knew everything now? They couldn't even resist the will of the gods, let alone Roland's will. Mr. Lucifer, what do you intend to do? Audrey realized something. She didn't know what her feelings were at this moment. Was it nervousness, vigilance, or some hidden joy? Just preparing to change all of this, or to put it more directly, we will completely overthrow Augustus's rule, from bottom to top, from inside out, completely changing this corrupt society. Roland did not conceal it, speaking unhurriedly. And you have two choices. First, inform your parents of our upcoming actions, so they can report to the Augustus royal family. Roland smiled as he looked at the complex-faced Audrey before him, speaking unhurriedly. Second, assist us in taking down all the nobles in Backland. Although taking down Backland was not difficult in the face of absolute strength, the relationships among the nobles were, after all, intricate, and their connections were the kind that Roland found troublesome to even glance at. In this situation, a professional was naturally needed to assist. Chapter 447, Audrey chose justice. Roland chose Audrey partly because they were friends, giving this Miss Justice of the Tarot Club a chance, and partly because he was genuinely curious. Curious about how far Audrey's justice could go. Audrey looked up in shock, her lips moved a few times, but she said nothing. Her mind was in a turmoil. At one moment, the faces of her parents and brother appeared in her mind, and at another, the emaciated workers in those factories, and the shocking data. Audrey's heart was torn in half at this moment. One half said, Audrey, you cannot betray your parents, while the other half said, that is justice, Audrey, you cannot turn a blind eye to those sufferings, at least you should not stop it. Audrey was in pain because of this. She did not doubt whether Lucifer and the others could achieve such a thing. As a member of the Tarot Club, she was well aware of Lucifer's mystique and knew that Mr. Fool and Evernight Goddess were allies. After a long while, Audrey finally said, will they die? Her voice was dry, devoid of its usual lightness. I am not a bloodthirsty person. If they have not committed crimes punishable by death, at most their property will be confiscated, and they will undergo labor reform. If they are like you, never having committed a crime, merely born into nobility, then besides property confiscation, they will most likely be released without charge after ideological education. We might even, at our discretion, allow people like you to retain a portion of your assets, though it won't be much, just enough for you to live as commoners. Roland answered frankly. He had naturally already decided how to deal with the old nobles. Killing them all directly was certainly not an option, as not every noble was guilty. The wealth they enjoyed might be sinful, but it was not a capital offense. After all, a person's birth should never be his crime. Of course, Roland would not be lenient with those nobles who deserved to die. Will my family be treated the same way? Audrey asked after a few seconds of silence. Yes, in this regard, we treat everyone equally. Only in this way can there be a complete revolution. Roland nodded, not concealing anything. If Audrey were an ordinary minor noble and actively participated in the revolution, making significant contributions, Roland might not be unable to grant her family a special pardon. This would not be a benefit for Audrey alone, but a reward for a warrior. However, the Hall family was too large. There was no room for compromise with a noble family of that level. At the very least, their property would certainly have to be confiscated. It sounds like I'm at a great disadvantage, having betrayed the nobility yet gaining nothing, Audrey said with a bitter, somewhat self-mocking smile. You can gain the right to participate in politics. Although it sounds cruel, for the old nobility, at least within 3 generations, I will not allow them to become the center of power again. But for those who actively participate in the revolution, even if they are nobles, they will receive a special exemption in this regard. This is the deserved reward for those who betray their class, Roland said with a smile. The gap between people is greater than that between people and dogs. Revolutionaries who betray their class and nobles who indulge in extravagance, even if born into the same circumstances, should naturally not be treated equally. Audrey was stunned for a moment. She lowered her eyes, then twitched the corner of her mouth, saying, "It sounds like it's not bad." After saying this, Audrey remained silent for a long time before looking up at Roland and saying, "Can you give me some time to consider?" "Of course. You can consider it until the operation begins tomorrow," Roland nodded and said. It seems you have made your decision." At the Hall residence, Roland glanced at Earl Hall and his wife, who were unconscious on the sofa, then his gaze fell on Audrey, who was sitting quietly on the opposite sofa. Audrey did not answer immediately. She simply gazed quietly at her parents' faces, her eyes filled with pain and sadness. She almost whispered, "I am in so much pain. I don't want to betray my parents, I don't want to betray my friends, but I also know very clearly that our current lives are built upon the deaths and suffering of many more people. If we don't change all of this, many people will die. Why must it be this way? Why is this world so cruel?" "Because this world is sick," Roland said softly. Audrey's body trembled. She suddenly composed herself, looked up at Roland, and asked, "Will you heal it?" "We are healing it," Roland said firmly. Audrey was silent for a second upon hearing this, then continued to ask, "Except for those who deserve it, none of them will die, right?" "Of course. Innocent people can at least live as commoners, right?" "Yes, and commoners in the new era will live much better than commoners now. As long as they are willing to work, they will receive their due compensation, they will not starve, they will not freeze, they will have enough rest time, and they will have everything a commoner should have." Audrey suddenly began to cry, like a helpless young girl. She cried and said, "I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm sorry, forgive me, Dad, Mom, I'm sorry. It's okay if you don't forgive me." When she said the last sentence, Audrey stopped crying. She wiped away her tears with her sleeve, something she would never have done before, as it did not align with noble interests. Of course, Audrey still did it, because from today on, she was no longer a noble. After wiping away her tears, Audrey took out a stack of densely written papers. The handwriting on them was fresh, with many corrections, showing that the writer had been very conflicted, having once written down certain names only to cross them out. But this was only the initial trace. Looking further down the pages, it became clear that the visible conflict in the handwriting diminished, as if the person who wrote these names had finally made up her mind and gradually became resolute. Justice Audrey handed the stack of papers to Roland and said, "This is the list of Loan's nobles. Everyone I know is on here. I know many of them and can take you there." She ultimately chose Justice. Just as she had chosen Justice, without hesitation when selecting her codename at the Tarot Club that year. Only then was she naive and did not know what justice meant. Now she understood the weight of this justice, but precisely because she understood, Justice Audrey made the same choice after painful deliberation. She could not turn a blind eye to those sufferings. "You have made the correct choice, Miss Justice." Roland looked deeply at Justice Audrey and finally showed a less formal smile, taking the list from her hand. Chapter 448 George III feels something is amiss. George III always felt that something was not quite right recently. Everything was developing as smoothly as he had anticipated. He was proceeding with the Black Emperor ritual with the help of his ancestors, had reached a cooperation with the Demonist sect, and had even obtained assistance from the Red Angel of the Aurora Order. He was on the verge of reaping the fruits of victory, while the night, storm, and steam deities seemed oblivious to the Augustus family's actions. Normally, according to this progression, he would soon become the Black Emperor. Of course, he might also fail to advance and die directly or turn into a monster. But for some unknown reason, George III still felt a subtle unease, as if something had slipped out of his control without his knowledge. Am I too sensitive, or is my spirituality warning me? George III rubbed his brow. He then took out several intelligence reports, which were investigations into the 3 major churches, and the results were all normal. George III then opened several more intelligence reports, these concerning several border cities. Due to their geographical location, George III was quite concerned about the situation at the border. However, since the capital was quite far from the border and there were no convenient communication methods, George III could only ascertain the situation there through intelligence relayed by his secret agents, subordinates, and officials. Again, everything was normal, with no issues except for Intis, which seemed restless and possibly prone to war. George III's brow furrowed even deeper. He then began to browse other intelligence reports, and his frown tightened further. Everything is before, everything is usual, everything is usual. All the intelligence, all the secret agents, all the subordinates were describing one thing to him: Loan was as it had always been. No, this isn't right. George III suddenly stood up from his chair. As the king chosen by Augustus, and a future Black Emperor candidate, George III, though a scumbag, was certainly not a fool. Precisely because of this, even if there was nothing amiss from the intelligence, he still keenly sensed that something was wrong. In fact, George III's intuition was correct, because after reaching cooperation with Roland, both the Night Church, the Storm Church, and the God of Steam and Machinery Church, very tacitly chose to blockade the Augustus family's intelligence network. After all, as the saying goes, know yourself and your enemy, and you will win 100 battles. Conversely, when a person's ears and eyes are covered, and everything he sees and hears is carefully arranged, the probability of his failure greatly increases. The Augustus family, at present, had been turned into a blind and deaf entity by the combined efforts of the three major churches. Someone, George III originally wanted to call his attendant in, but he suddenly stopped halfway through. Because George III realized something: if all the intelligence he received was false, it meant that many of his subordinates had either betrayed him, or been subdued or replaced. In that case, could the people in the palace truly be trusted? George III would not have doubted this before, but now he had to. So George III did not choose to call his attendant in, but chose another path. He quietly found Augustus's ancestor, William I. "What is it?" William I looked up at his disappointing descendant and asked. "Ancestor, I suspect." George III then explained that he had discovered that the intelligence he had received recently might be problematic, and then said with a solemn expression, "If this intelligence is truly false, then it means someone has blockaded our intelligence network. This is not something any random organization can do, and it would be difficult for even one of the three major churches to achieve." By the end of his words, George III's expression was grim. Unless the three major churches joined forces. William I's expression, however, showed no surprise, contrary to George III's expectations. He merely sighed and said, "George, do you know why the family wants you to become the Black Emperor? Because only a family with a true God truly has a voice before the seven deities, and can obtain a glimmer of hope in the apocalypse," George III answered without hesitation. "Yes." William I nodded. He gazed at his descendant and said, "I once thought that the seven deities would not oppose this matter. Even if they did not wish for an eighth true God to appear, for the sake of countering the apocalypse, they would not directly oppose it after it happened. But it seems I was wrong." William I sighed. Had William I, A Sequence 1, truly not noticed what was happening to George III? Of course not. William I had sensed that something was amiss even earlier than George III. However, after sensing something was wrong, he did not take any action, but allowed everything to happen. "Ancestor, you knew all along, why?" George III's eyes widened in surprise. He then thought of something and said, "Are the three deities truly so insurmountable?" "No, the three deities are not formidable. Although Sequence 0 is indeed incredibly powerful, they cannot easily leave the astral world now, and due to the apocalypse, they are not as terrifying to Augustus as one might think." William I shook his head, looking at George III and said, "What I fear is the existence behind the deities. It is the existence that made the deities change their minds and unite them. He is the one who opposes all of this." William I did not know of Roland's existence, but he guessed that such an existence existed, which was not difficult. As an existence who had lived from the fourth epoch until now, William I had witnessed many things happen, so he was very clear about the state of the seven deities, and the conflicts between the storm, sun, and wisdom deities. William I was even more aware that regarding the current social situation, it wasn't that no deity wanted to change it, but due to the apocalypse, and the stability and anchor of society, no true God chose to intensely intervene in the real world. It was precisely because he was so clear about these matters that when William I discovered that most of the 7 deities seemed to be making secret major moves, preparing for some kind of change, and that the storm, sun, and knowledge deities no longer seemed to be in opposition as before, William I felt fear. He did not think that such a thing would happen because the deities suddenly became good people or lost their minds. William I knew that there was only one reason that could make the deities act this way, and that they could not defy forced them to do so. And an existence that even the deities could not defy. William I took a deep breath. His gaze fell on George III, and he suddenly smiled, saying, "Perhaps we will both die here today." Chapter 449, William I, who backstabbed the witch. George III was stunned. He looked at William I in shock, unsure if he was shocked by his words or by the fact that he could still smile in such a situation. I don't understand. If the ancestor had long sensed a powerful existence that wouldn't allow all this to happen, then why didn't he directly tell us to stop our actions to avoid angering them? After a brief shock, George III suddenly realized something and looked at William I in confusion. There must be a villain in fairy tales, and we are that villain. William I looked at George III calmly and said, "Many things cannot be redeemed by stopping them now. We have already become the villains. If we don't see it through now, then how can they become heroes?" As a sequence 1, it was difficult to hide many things from William I when he intended to investigate. It was precisely because of this that he knew many things and understood the other party's intentions. The existence that unified the gods did not need Augustus to turn over a new leaf, but for Augustus to be slain as the evil dragon, thereby bringing about a thorough change in this society. William I saw this point, so he chose to cooperate with the other party. Not for anything else, but to survive a desperate situation. George III was genuinely confused. He didn't understand what his ancestor was thinking. What was this, sacrificing himself to fulfill others? No, only then can the innocent members of Augustus who have never participated in these matters live better. William I naturally saw George III's confusion. However, he then disregarded this unpromising descendant and looked in a certain direction, saying, "Are you satisfied with the ending I offered for this story? I have to say, this is a bit beyond my expectation. Sure enough, there are no fools among those who can become angels. Ah, except for little N." Roland walked out from the shadows with a smile, having already arrived here. He had originally planned to deal with Augustus immediately after the revolution began, but he didn't expect to hear such a conversation. "Good day, Your Excellency, how should I address you?" William I merely glanced at Roland, then quickly lowered his eyes as if burned, and asked, "You can call me Lucifer." Roland smiled and said, "Or Lucifer." Hearing this name, William I did not show too much surprise. He had not been without speculation about this, but he respectfully said, "Your Majesty Lucifer, I know your will. You want to bring a thorough change to this society. I have no intention of stopping it, nor can I stop it. Augustus can fully cooperate with your Majesty's every action, including sending the guilty family members to the guillotine. I only ask that you pardon those Augustus who have never committed evil deeds, and give them a chance to live as ordinary people. They were unaware of those schemes and have never committed crimes." William I was a witness to the War of the Four Emperors, so he knew very well what royal family members would face after the monarchy was overthrown. The once illustrious Tudor family now had its direct bloodline almost severed, and Solomon, who once dominated the northern continent, now only had an existence like the King of the Five Seas. And Augustus would be even more tragic than them. William I did not want this to happen, but he also could not resist Roland, so he chose to survive a desperate situation. I am not a bloodthirsty person. If they are Augustus who have not committed crimes, they can naturally live as ordinary people. I can assure you, no one will hunt them down." Roland smiled. He truly had no intention of completely annihilating Augustus. After all, he wasn't afraid of Augustus restoring their power, and not everyone in the Augustus family was guilty. For example, the prince who became a scapegoat in the original story was clearly ignorant of the Black Emperor's affairs. Perhaps he was guilty, but not to the point of death. Thank you for your mercy." William I visibly breathed a sigh of relief. Roland looked at him with interest and suddenly asked, "What about you? William, are you truly willing to exit as the villain? William I fell silent. His hand, hanging at his side, clenched tightly, so much so that blood could be seen dripping. William I gave a self-deprecating smile and said, I am not willing. He looked up at Roland, then suddenly smiled and said, so I want to exchange my actions for an opportunity from you, an opportunity to live. Roland raised an eyebrow. Adhering to the principle of making use of waste, he had always been open to giving those willing to reform a chance, just as he had with the Pale Empress and the members of the Rose School of Thought. After all, a trait was still not as useful as a person. Roland was always more merciful towards useful tools. In this situation, if William I genuinely repented and began atoning for his past sins, Roland truly had no intention of necessarily killing him. He wasn't that righteous. So Roland looked at William I and asked with interest, what did you do? He could tell that William I's actions were not merely his tacit approval of all this happening. If I'm not mistaken, the one the War Angel currently follows should be you. William I did not keep him in suspense and immediately replied, you also know that the Demonist sect has always cooperated with us. Perhaps you would be interested in severely damaging the Demonist sect. Roland raised an eyebrow. He had to admit, William I truly hit the mark. If Roland had any particularly disliked organizations, the Demonist sect was certainly one of them. And as for the primordial Demoness, that madwoman, Roland had added her to his blacklist long ago. I am indeed interested in that. Roland nodded with a smile, looking at William I and saying, but is it really all right for you to betray your allies like this? Aren't you afraid of losing points in my estimation? William I paused, then took a deep breath and said, the premise is that they are truly allies. Some things were unclear before investigation, but after investigating, William I had more or less sensed something, such as the primordial demoness not genuinely wishing for the birth of the Black Emperor. The Demonist sect's cooperation with them might have been nothing more than a deception from the very beginning, designed to trick them into obtaining the Conqueror trait. Thinking of this, a hint of resentment and a touch of schadenfreude couldn't help but flash in William I's eyes. Roland stared at him for a few seconds, clearly seeing something, and then smiled, continuing. I will not kill you, but from now on, you must atone for all the crimes you have committed in the past. Before your sins are cleared, if you choose to commit another crime or escape, I will not give you a second chance. Of course, if you're lucky enough, perhaps after being made into a sealed artifact, you might even retain a part of your consciousness, Roland said with a very bright smile. Your will is my will. William I felt a chill in his heart as he lowered his head and said. Roland then smiled, his gaze falling on George III beside him. The latter clearly wanted to say something, but before he could speak, Roland smiled and said. Prepare the guillotine early. I hope the story of George III and the guillotine can forever exist in future textbooks as a historical tale. Some people Roland could give a chance, others he was unwilling to give. He didn't deny that he was double-standard and willful, but he was just such a person. Chapter 450 Little K hunts the Despair Witch. Despair Witch Panatia always felt something was off. Their Demonist sect's cooperation with Augustus was going smoothly, everything was fine, except the promised Conqueror trait hadn't arrived yet. She was also about to use this incident to spread the Great Smog in Loan, thoroughly digesting her Sequence 4 potion and advancing to Sequence 3 as an undying witch, but Despair Witch Panatia just felt something was not right. But what exactly was wrong? Despair Witch Panatia pondered, her gaze inadvertently sweeping over Mr. A passing by, and she paused. She suddenly asked, Mr. A, who are these two people beside you? Although different from the original, under Roland's instruction, the Aurora Order in this world still feigned cooperation with Augustus but was always ready to betray him. Mr. A's movements paused. He turned his head to look at Despair Witch Panatia, his expression showing no respect or fear towards a demigod, only calmly stating, they are the Lord's envoys and will help me complete the upcoming descent ritual. This was naturally a lie, but Mr. A said it without any guilt. Upon hearing this, Despair Witch Panatia's gaze fell on the two people behind Mr. A. Both were tightly wrapped in robes, one even wearing a mask, making their faces completely unidentifiable. The other smiled at her. It was a face with no memorable features, so ordinary that it would be impossible to find once it blended into a crowd. Despair Witch Panatia frowned. Her intuition told her something was amiss, but constrained by Mr. A's identity, she couldn't just act forcibly based on intuition. After all, the Aurora Order also had a true god behind it, and for some reason, the true creator's condition recently seemed much better than before. Despair Witch Panatia merely heightened her vigilance, then she revealed a gentle and charming smile. Stroking her hair, she said, "I apologize, I'm not doubting you, but today's matter is, after all, of great importance. For both of us to get what we want, I have to be more cautious, so." She glanced meaningfully at the two people behind Mr. A. "Are you done talking?" Mr. A still looked at her calmly, completely unmoved by her beauty, instead showing a puzzled expression, as if wondering what nonsense the other party was spouting. Despair Witch Panatia, whose charm had failed, paused her movements and no longer hinted, but directly said, "May I see the true face of this esteemed guest?" Although appearance sometimes doesn't reveal much, not everyone in this world is a faceless, or possesses a magical item related to the faceless. Many times, a person's appearance is difficult to change. In Despair Witch Panatia's view, since the other party was so secretive, their true face might have some issues, perhaps it was someone she knew. Mr. A refused clearly and decisively. He looked at Despair Witch Panatia and said, "Do you have nothing to do?" Despair Witch Panatia, having been refused, gave Mr. A deep look. Her figure suddenly flickered, appearing before the tightly masked and wrapped person, reaching out to remove the other party's mask. Rumble. The next second, silver-white lightning descended from the sky, striking Despair Witch Panatia. If she hadn't reacted in time to condense an ice defense, that single strike might have severely injured her. "Actually, according to the script, I should have waited a bit longer to hunt you." The ordinary man with no memorable features spoke. He still stood beside Mr. A, his expression seemingly a little helpless. "After all, I'm not sure if the audience is in place yet." That's right, this ordinary man with no memorable features was Little K, who had changed his appearance using his faceless ability. After acquiring Cavituva, a heavyweight marionettist, and using this marionettist for some time, Little K naturally finished digesting his marionettist potion ahead of schedule and needed to prepare for his advancement to Sequence 4 Trickmaster. The Trickmaster's advancement ritual required Little K to murder a Sequence 4 demigod under the witness of numerous spectators. The latter was simple, as Little K now had Cavituva, a Sequence 3 marionettist, but the former requirement was a bit tricky, as it was very dangerous for ordinary people to witness a demigod-level Beander battle. So, to avoid threatening ordinary people, Little K asked Mr. Adam to be the audience. Adam, who was only one step away from becoming a god, was enough to substitute quantity with quality. "I am here." Just then, Little K heard a familiar voice. He looked over and, sure enough, saw an Adam had grown out of thin air at some point. Little K couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. He immediately nodded to Adam, then looked at Despair Witch Panatia, who was being pursued by lightning, no longer hesitating, and began to concentrate on hunting her. "Thank you, Miss Audrey, there are still 137 more." Little Amon pushed his monocle up his face, smiling at Justice Audrey beside him. He was the one responsible for arresting all the nobles and wealthy merchants, big and small, in Backland with Audrey, awaiting subsequent trials. At this moment, Little Amon was no longer an unremarkable Sequence 5, but had already upgraded to a genuine Sequence 3. This was a gift from the main body. For Little Amon, advancing was very simple, not requiring potions like others, but only needing to spend the main body's gold coins. After all, Little Amon was still an Amon avatar at the end of the day, and even if his power level wasn't high, he was still an King of Angels in essence. "I am merely doing what is right." Audrey lowered her eyes, not looking at Haluer's family, who were now wearing silver handcuffs. "Why are you arresting us? We haven't committed any crimes." Haluer's eyes were puzzled and shocked. She had some impression of Audrey, knowing she was a count's daughter, but completely didn't understand why the other party would suddenly appear at her house with others and arrest them all. Compared to Haluer, who directly asked, her parents were clearly much calmer. From their eyes, they were probably assessing the situation and thinking about subsequent action plans. "I'm very sorry." Audrey sighed. She looked at Haluer and said, "You indeed haven't committed any crimes, but the existence of nobles itself is a mistake." Haluer was visibly stunned. She showed a bewildered and confused expression, as if she completely didn't understand why Audrey would say that. After all, in her eyes, the existence of nobles was natural and self-evident. You want to overthrow the nobles. Haluer's father finally couldn't hold back at this moment, revealing a shocked expression. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.